The typewriters in the report room had their own distinct voices, each machine contributing to the gentle symphony that filled the space during the busiest hours of each shift. Detective Luis Marino had grown to recognize the subtle differences in their sounds. The way Sergeant Walsh's old Underwood clicked with a slightly sharper tone than the newer IBM Selectrics that had been introduced the previous year. The rhythm of typing mixed with the soft rustle of carbon paper and the occasional ding of a carriage return, creating a backdrop of productivity that seemed to slow time itself. Report writing was an art form that few people outside law enforcement truly understood. It required the ability to transform the chaos of human experience into clear, factual language that could be understood by judges, lawyers, social workers, and other officers who might need to reference the case months or even years later. Every word mattered, every detail had to be accurate, and the tone had to remain professional regardless of the emotions that the original incident might have stirred. Detective Marino settled at his usual desk, rolling a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter along with the carbon copies that would create the permanent records. The case he needed to document had occurred earlier that day, a domestic disturbance call that had evolved into something more complex than the initial report suggested. As he positioned his fingers over the keys, he thought about how to capture the nuances of what he had witnessed without losing the objective clarity that made police reports useful. The address had been 1247 Maple Street, a small ranch house in a neighborhood where most of the residents had lived for decades. The call had come in at 3:17 p.m., reported by a neighbor who had heard shouting and what sounded like furniture being moved roughly. When Detective Marino and Officer Kim had arrived, they had found a situation that required careful documentation of both facts and context. He began typing, letting the familiar rhythm of the keys guide his thoughts into the structured format that police reports required. The heading information came first, establishing the basic parameters of the incident: date, time, location, responding officers, and the nature of the call. These details created the framework within which the more complex human story would be contained. The narrative section required more thought. Detective Marino had learned over his 15 years of police work that the most important skill in report writing was knowing which details to include and how to present them in a way that preserved their significance without introducing bias or speculation. The incident at 1247 Maple Street had involved Robert and Linda Patterson, married for 32 years, and their ongoing struggle to care for Robert's elderly mother, who had been living with them since suffering a stroke 6 months earlier. The typing continued, each word chosen carefully to create an accurate record of what had been observed and reported. Mrs. Patterson had explained that her mother-in-law's condition had been deteriorating recently, requiring increased assistance with basic daily activities. The stress of providing this care while both she and her husband worked full-time had been building for weeks, finally erupting in the argument that had prompted the neighbor's call to police. Detective Marino paused in his typing to consult his notes, ensuring that he captured the exact words that Mrs. Patterson had used to describe her situation. She had spoken about feeling overwhelmed and guilty, trapped between her desire to provide good care for her mother-in-law and her recognition that they might not be equipped to handle the level of assistance that was needed. Her husband had expressed similar feelings, along with his reluctance to consider alternative arrangements that might be better for his mother's health and safety. The report continued to develop as Detective Marino translated his observations into the precise language required for official documentation. He described the condition of the house, which had been modified to accommodate Mrs. Patterson's mother, but still presented challenges for someone with limited mobility. He noted the presence of medical equipment and medications, the obvious signs of careful attention to the elderly woman's needs, and the equally obvious indicators of stress and exhaustion in both caregivers. The resolution of the incident had required more than simply mediating the immediate argument. Detective Marino had contacted the county's Elder Services office, arranging for a social worker to visit the Patterson home and assess the situation. He had also provided information about respite care services and support groups for families dealing with similar challenges. The report documented these interventions, creating a record that could be referenced if follow-up services were needed. As he typed the final paragraphs of the Patterson report, Detective Marino reflected on how many similar situations he had encountered and documented over the years. Each family's circumstances were unique, but the underlying challenges were remarkably consistent. Good people, trying to do the right thing while struggling with situations that exceeded their resources and experience. The police reports that documented these cases served as more than legal records. They were testimonies to the complex realities of family life and community responsibility. The next report, waiting in his queue, dealt with a different type of incident, but required the same careful attention to detail and context. A bicycle had been reported stolen from outside Morrison Elementary School, taken while 10-year-old Marcus Williams was inside participating in an after-school program. The theft itself was straightforward, but Detective Marino's investigation had revealed circumstances that deserved careful documentation. He rolled a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter, positioning the carbon copies with the practiced efficiency that came from years of repetition. The bicycle theft report would be shorter than the domestic disturbance documentation, but it required the same attention to accuracy and completeness. Every case, regardless of its apparent magnitude, deserved thorough documentation. The bicycle had been a birthday gift from Marcus's grandmother, a red Schwinn that represented months of saving from her fixed income. Marcus's mother, Sharon Williams, worked 2 part-time jobs to support her son and could not afford to replace the bicycle immediately. The theft had occurred despite the presence of a bicycle rack and Marcus's careful efforts to secure the bike with a lock that had proven inadequate against bolt cutters. Detective Marino's investigation had led him to the nearby park, where he had found the stolen bicycle abandoned near the basketball courts. The quick recovery had been fortunate, but his report needed to document the broader context that made this seemingly minor theft significant for the people involved. He typed carefully, describing how the bicycle represented not just transportation for Marcus, but independence and connection to his peer group. The report also documented Detective Marino's conversation with school officials about bicycle security, leading to discussions about installing a more secure bike storage area and providing education about effective locks and security measures. These preventive measures would benefit all students who rode bicycles to school, turning the incident into an opportunity for community improvement. As he finished the bicycle theft report, Detective Marino pulled another case file from the stack on his desk. This one involved a series of complaints about unleashed dogs in Riverside Park, incidents that had been reported multiple times over the past several weeks, but had not yet been resolved. The complexity of the situation required careful documentation to understand the various perspectives and interests involved. The park served multiple functions for different groups of community members. Families with young children used the playground equipment and open spaces for recreational activities. Elderly residents enjoyed the walking paths and benches for exercise and social interaction. Dog owners appreciated the large open areas for exercising their pets, though city ordinances required dogs to remain leashed at all times. Detective Marino began typing a comprehensive report that would document not just the specific complaints, but the underlying tensions between different user groups. Mrs. Chun, who brought her grandchildren to the park regularly, had expressed concerns about large dogs running free near the playground area. Mr. Rodriguez, who walked his aging retriever in the park every morning, had argued that well-behaved dogs should be allowed to run free in designated areas away from children. The report detailed Detective Marino's observations during several visits to the park at different times of day, documenting the patterns of use and the specific incidents that had generated complaints. He had witnessed generally responsible dog ownership, with most pet owners maintaining control of their animals, even when they were not technically following the leash requirements. However, he had also observed situations where unleashed dogs had approached children or elderly visitors in ways that could reasonably be perceived as threatening. His investigation had led to conversations with city parks and recreation officials about the possibility of creating a designated off-leash area within the park, separated from the playground and walking paths by appropriate fencing. The report documented these discussions, creating a record that could support future policy decisions about park management and community needs. The stack of case files seemed endless, but Detective Marino found satisfaction in the steady rhythm of documentation. Each report represented his contribution to the vast archive of human experience that law enforcement accumulated, a record that would be preserved and potentially referenced for years to come. Future officers might read these reports while investigating similar cases, learning from his observations and building on his efforts to understand the complex dynamics of community life. A case involving suspected check fraud required particularly careful documentation, as financial crimes often involved intricate details that needed to be preserved with absolute accuracy. Mrs. Elizabeth Norton, a 78-year-old retiree, had noticed irregularities in her bank statements that suggested someone had been forging her signature on checks written against her account. The investigation had revealed a complex scheme involving her part-time caregiver, who had been gradually stealing small amounts over several months. Detective Marino's report documented not just the technical aspects of the fraud, but the personal betrayal that Mrs. Norton had experienced. She had trusted her caregiver with access to her home and personal information, making the theft particularly devastating from an emotional perspective. The report captured these human dimensions while maintaining the objective tone required for potential prosecution. The investigation had required coordination with bank officials, analysis of handwriting samples, and interviews with other elderly residents who employed the same caregiver. Detective Marino's report documented each step of this process, creating a comprehensive record that would support both criminal charges and civil recovery efforts. The resolution had been complicated by Mrs. Norton's mixed feelings about prosecution. While she wanted to recover her stolen money and prevent the caregiver from victimizing other elderly residents, she also felt sympathy for the young woman who had been struggling financially to support her own family. Detective Marino's report documented these considerations, recognizing that justice often involved balancing multiple valid concerns rather than simply applying legal sanctions. As the evening progressed, the report room gradually emptied as officers completed their documentation and moved on to other duties. Detective Marino continued typing, working through the remaining cases in his queue with the same methodical attention that characterized all his work. The familiar sounds of the typewriter created a meditative rhythm that helped him focus on the precise language needed to capture complex human situations in official documentation. A noise complaint from the Westfield apartments had involved multiple residents and required careful documentation of competing claims about responsibility and appropriate behavior. The initial complaint had been filed by Mr. Harrison in apartment 3B, who reported that his upstairs neighbors were playing music loudly and moving furniture at unreasonable hours. Investigation had revealed that the upstairs residents, a young family with 2 small children, were not being deliberately disruptive, but were dealing with the normal sounds of family life in a building with poor sound insulation. Detective Marino's report documented his conversations with multiple residents, painting a picture of good people trying to coexist in a building that had not been designed with adequate consideration for noise control. The resolution had involved discussions with building management about possible structural improvements, along with agreements between neighbors about reasonable quiet hours and advance notification of any unusual activities. The documentation continued with a case involving graffiti on the side of Murphy's hardware store, where someone had spray painted what appeared to be gang symbols on the brick wall facing the alley. Detective Marino's investigation had revealed that the symbols were actually artwork created by a local teenager who had been copying designs from a book about urban art. With no understanding of their potential gang associations, the report documented his conversations with the teenager, Martin Suarez, who had been genuinely shocked to learn that his artwork might be interpreted as gang activity. Martin had been interested in graphic design and had been practicing different artistic techniques without considering the social context of his chosen medium. The resolution had involved having Martin clean off the graffiti and redirecting his artistic interests toward legal venues, including a mentorship program with a local commercial artist. These cases accumulated in Detective Marino's reports like chapters in an ongoing book about community life, each one contributing to a larger understanding of how people attempted to live together peacefully despite their different needs, perspectives, and circumstances. The typing continued late into the evening, documenting the steady work of maintaining social order through patience, communication, and creative problem solving. A burglary report required extensive documentation of physical evidence and witness statements, but also included important context about the economic pressures that had motivated the crime. The burglar, a 19-year-old named Tommy Chun, had been stealing items to sell for money to help support his family after his father's injury had left him unable to work. Detective Marino's report documented both the criminal activity and the underlying circumstances that had contributed to Tommy's poor decision-making. The investigation had led to connections with social service agencies that could provide assistance to the Chen family, addressing the root causes that had motivated the burglary rather than simply processing Tommy through the criminal justice system. Detective Marino's report documented these interventions, creating a record that demonstrated how law enforcement could work with other community resources to address crime prevention as well as crime response. As midnight approached, Detective Marino continued working through his case files, each report requiring the same careful attention to detail and context. A domestic violence call had involved a complex situation where both parties claimed to be victims, requiring extensive documentation of physical evidence, witness statements, and the history of previous incidents. The report captured the nuances of a relationship where patterns of mutual abuse had escalated to the point where intervention was necessary for everyone's safety. The documentation process required Detective Marino to balance multiple considerations: the immediate safety of the individuals involved, the legal requirements for evidence preservation, and the long-term goal of breaking cycles of violence that often persisted across generations. His report included recommendations for counseling services, legal advocacy resources, and follow-up monitoring to ensure that protective orders were being respected. A vandalism case at the high school had involved students using spray paint to create what they called protest art on the side of the gymnasium, expressing their opposition to budget cuts that had eliminated several popular programs. Detective Marino's report documented not just the property damage but the underlying concerns that had motivated the students' actions, creating a record that could inform discussions about constructive channels for student advocacy. The resolution had involved having the students clean up their graffiti while also facilitating meetings between student representatives and school administration to discuss their concerns about budget priorities. Detective Marino's report documented these discussions, recognizing that effective law enforcement often required addressing the social conditions that contributed to rule violations rather than simply punishing the immediate behavior. The typewriter keys continued their steady rhythm as Detective Marino worked through the final cases in his queue. Each report represented hours of investigation, multiple interviews, and careful consideration of how to balance various community interests. The documentation process transformed these complex human situations into clear, factual records that would become part of the permanent archive of police work. A fraud case involving fake charity solicitations had required coordination with multiple agencies and extensive documentation of the methods used to deceive elderly residents. The perpetrator had been posing as a representative of a veterans organization, collecting donations that were never forwarded to their intended recipients. Detective Marino's report documented the investigation process while also including recommendations for public education about charity fraud prevention. The case had been resolved through cooperation with state and federal agencies that specialized in consumer protection, demonstrating how local police work often connected to broader patterns of criminal activity. Detective Marino's report documented these connections, creating a record that could be referenced by investigators working on similar cases in other jurisdictions. As he typed the final words of his last report, Detective Marino reflected on the evening's work. Each case had required him to serve as investigator, mediator, social worker, and chronicler, documenting not just crimes, but the complex web of human relationships and social conditions that shaped community life. The reports he had created would become part of the vast archive of police work, preserving these stories for future reference and analysis. The report room had grown quiet around him, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the night shift continuing their patrol duties. Detective Marino gathered his completed reports, ensuring that each one was properly formatted and contained all necessary documentation. These papers would be filed in the appropriate case folders, becoming part of the permanent record of police work that stretched back decades. Walking to the filing cabinets, where his reports would be stored, Detective Marino thought about the officers who had performed this same task in previous years, and those who would continue the work in years to come. Each report represented a small but important contribution to the ongoing effort to understand and respond to the challenges of community life, documenting the patient work of maintaining social order through careful attention to individual human situations. The reports would rest quietly in their files, holding their stories with the same dignity that characterized all police documentation. Future investigators might reference these cases while working on similar problems, learning from the approaches that had been successful and building on the foundations that previous officers had established. The work continued, one carefully documented case at a time, creating an archive of human experience that testified to the complex realities of law, enforcement, and community life. In the quiet of the late-night hours, these reports represented more than just paperwork. They were testimonies to the dedication and professionalism of officers who understood that their job involved not just enforcing laws, but preserving the delicate balance that made civilized community life possible. Each case had been handled with care and documented with precision, adding to the vast collection of stories that comprise the ongoing history of police work and service to the community. Asterisk, the archive stretched further into the building's foundation than most people realized, extending beneath the parking lot and into spaces that had been carved from the earth. When the precinct was first constructed in 1952, records clerk Margaret Foster had spent the better part of 30 years navigating these corridors, learning the geography of human documentation that filled row upon row of steel cabinets and wooden file boxes that predated the modern filing systems. Each section of the archives had its own character, determined by the era of the cases it contained and the particular approaches to documentation that had been used during different periods of the department's history. The oldest files, those from the 1950s and early 1960s, were stored in wooden cabinets with brass hardware that had developed a gentle patina over the decades. These cases were documented on heavy paper with manual typewriters, the letters slightly uneven but deeply impressed into the page, creating a tactile quality that connected the reader to the officers who had created these records. Margaret moved slowly through Section K, where cases from 1963 through 1967 waited in their ordered silence. The dust here was not neglect, but simply the natural accumulation that came with time, settling gently on folders that were rarely disturbed, but maintained with careful attention when access was needed. She carried a soft cloth and a small brush, tools she used to clean files when they were retrieved for reference. Treating each document with the respect due to historical artifacts, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their steady glow across filing cabinets that rose from floor to ceiling, creating narrow aisles that seemed to extend into infinity. Margaret had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which files contained particularly significant cases, not from any official marking, but from the slight wear patterns on folder tabs, the thickness of documentation that suggested extensive investigation, the careful notation systems that previous clerks had used to cross-reference related cases. She paused at cabinet K47, running her fingers along the smooth metal surface before opening the heavy drawer. Inside, manila folders hung in perfect alignment, each one containing the carefully preserved documentation of cases that had once demanded the urgent attention of detectives and patrol officers, but now rested in the quiet dignity of historical preservation. The paper had aged to a gentle cream color, developing the particular fragrance that came with decades of careful storage in climate-controlled environments. The first file she pulled contained the documentation of a missing person case from March 1964, when 15-year-old Rebecca Thompson had disappeared from her family's home on Elm Street during a particularly turbulent period in her parents' marriage. Detective William Harrison had been assigned to the case, conducting an investigation that stretched across 3 months and involved coordination with police departments in 7 different states. Reading through Detective Harrison's methodical reports, Margaret could trace the evolution of his understanding as new information emerged and different possibilities were explored. The initial assumption had been that Rebecca had run away from home to escape the stress of her parents' domestic difficulties, but as the investigation progressed, other scenarios had been considered and systematically eliminated through careful detective work. The file contained dozens of witness interviews, each one typed on the heavy paper that characterized police documentation from that era. Detective Harrison had spoken with Rebecca's teachers, her friends, neighbors who might have observed anything unusual, and family members who could provide insight into her state of mind during the weeks before her disappearance. Each interview was documented with the same careful attention to detail, preserving not just facts but the subtle impressions that might prove significant as the investigation developed. Margaret found photographs tucked into the back of the file, black and white images that captured Rebecca's bedroom exactly as it had been found on the morning her absence was discovered. The bed was neatly made, clothes hung properly in the closet, school books stacked on the desk in preparation for classes that Rebecca would never attend. There was something profoundly moving about these photographs, the way they preserved a moment of ordinary teenage life that had been interrupted by circumstances that were still being discovered as the investigation unfolded. The breakthrough in Rebecca's case had come not through dramatic detective work, but through the patient networking that characterized much of the successful police work from that era. Detective Harrison had maintained contact with police departments throughout the region, sharing Rebecca's description and photograph with officers who might encounter her during routine patrols or investigations. 3 months after her disappearance, a patrol officer in Portland had recognized Rebecca from the photograph, Finding her working in a diner under an assumed name, the circumstances of Rebecca's reappearance had been more complex than simple runaway behavior. She had been recruited by what the reports described as a group of young people who traveled between cities, supporting themselves through a combination of temporary employment and petty theft. Rebecca had initially joined the group as an escape from family problems, but had quickly discovered that the freedom she sought came with its own forms of exploitation and danger. Detective Harrison's final reports documented his careful handling of Rebecca's return, working with family counselors and social workers to address the underlying problems that had contributed to her decision to leave home. The resolution had involved not just reuniting Rebecca with her family, but helping all parties understand and address the communication failures and emotional pressures that had made running away seem like the only viable option. Margaret carefully returned Rebecca's file to its proper position and pulled another, this one dealing with a series of burglaries that had occurred in the Riverside neighborhood during the summer of 1965. The investigating officer, Detective Robert Chun, had approached the case with the methodical patience that characterized much of the police work from that era, documenting each incident with comprehensive attention to detail and context. The burglaries had followed a consistent pattern, occurring during daytime hours when residents were at work, targeting homes that backed up to the wooded area behind Riverside Park. The burglar had shown unusual selectivity, taking jewelry and small electronics but leaving behind items that would have been easier to carry and potentially more valuable. Detective Chun's reports described his efforts to understand this pattern, looking for clues about the perpetrator's experience, motivations, and methods. The investigation had required extensive coordination with residents of the affected neighborhood, with Detective Chun conducting dozens of interviews to establish timelines, identify potential witnesses, and understand the social dynamics that might be relevant to the case. His reports documented not just the criminal activity, but the way the burglaries had affected the sense of security and community trust that residents had previously taken for granted. The file contained hand-drawn maps showing the location of each burglary in relation to the park and surrounding streets, along with detailed floor plans of several of the targeted homes. Detective Chun had spent considerable time understanding the geography of the neighborhood, looking for patterns in the burglar's route selection and escape, methods that might suggest familiarity with the area or particular knowledge of police patrol schedules. The resolution had come through a combination of careful observation and community cooperation. Detective Chen had noticed that the burglaries seemed to occur on days when certain residents were away from the neighborhood for extended periods, suggesting that the perpetrator had some method of monitoring daily routines. This observation had led him to focus on people who had regular access to information about residents' schedules and travel plans. The breakthrough had identified the burglar as David Morrison, a 17-year-old who worked part-time for a local delivery service that brought groceries and household supplies to many of the neighborhood residents. David's job had given him knowledge of when people would be away from home, along with familiarity with the layout of houses and the location of valuable items. Detective Chun's reports documented his careful approach to David's arrest, recognizing that the young man's criminal behavior was motivated more by opportunity and poor judgment than by malicious intent. The case resolution had involved not just criminal charges, but a comprehensive approach to addressing the underlying factors that had contributed to David's criminal behavior. Detective Chun had worked with David's family, his employer, and social service agencies to develop a plan that included restitution to victims, community service, and educational programs designed to help David understand the impact of his actions on the people he had victimized. Margaret continued moving through the files, each one representing a carefully preserved slice of the community's history during a period when police work had been characterized by patient investigation and comprehensive documentation. The cases from this era seemed to reflect a different approach to law enforcement, one that had time for the kind of thorough investigation and community engagement that Detective Chun had brought to the Riverside burglaries. The next file dealt with a vandalism case that had required months of investigation to resolve. Someone had been damaging vehicles parked along Main Street during the overnight hours, using a sharp object to scratch paint and slash tires in what appeared to be random acts of destruction. The investigating officer, Sergeant Patricia Wong, had approached the case with the same methodical attention that characterized all the police work. Documented in these archives, Sergeant Wong's reports described her efforts to understand the pattern behind the vandalism, looking for connections between the targeted vehicles, the timing of the incidents, and the specific types of damage that were being inflicted. She had spent numerous nights conducting surveillance in the area, documenting the routine activities that occurred along Main Street. During the hours when the vandalism typically took place, the investigation had revealed that the vandalism was not random, but followed a subtle pattern related to parking violations and neighborhood tensions. The damaged vehicles belonged to people who regularly parked in ways that blocked driveways, prevented delivery trucks from accessing businesses, or otherwise created inconvenience for residents and business owners. The vandal had been expressing frustration with these parking problems through destructive behavior, rather than using official channels for complaint and resolution. The case had been solved through community engagement rather than traditional detective work. Sergeant Wong had organized meetings between affected vehicle owners, neighborhood residents, and business owners to discuss parking issues and develop mutually acceptable solutions. The vandalism had stopped after these discussions led to improved communication and more considerate parking behavior, addressing the underlying tensions that had motivated the destructive activities. These archives contained hundreds of similar cases, each one documented with the same careful attention to detail and community context. Margaret found profound satisfaction in maintaining these records, understanding that they represented more than just law enforcement documentation, but rather a comprehensive archive of community life during different periods of the city's development. The filing cabinets in Section L contained cases from the late 1960s, a period when social changes throughout the country had created new challenges for local law enforcement. These files documented how officers had adapted their approaches to handle situations that had no clear precedent, developing new methods for community engagement and conflict resolution that would influence police work for decades to come. Margaret pulled a thick file documenting a series of demonstrations that had occurred at the university during the spring of 1968, when students had organized protests against the Vietnam War and various university policies. The file contained dozens of reports from different officers, each one contributing to a comprehensive record of how the police department had handled these unprecedented events. The reports revealed careful planning and restraint in the department's approach to the demonstrations. Rather than treating the protests as simple law enforcement problems, officers had worked to understand the students' concerns and find ways to protect both their right to peaceful assembly and the safety of all community members. The documentation showed extensive coordination with university officials, city government representatives, and student leaders to develop protocols that would allow expression of political views while maintaining public order. The investigation files also contain correspondence between police officials and community leaders, documenting the conversations and negotiations that had preceded each major demonstration. There had been a clear effort to establish communication channels that would prevent misunderstandings and reduce the potential for confrontation between protesters and law enforcement officers. The resolution of the spring 1968 demonstrations had established precedents that influenced the department's approach to similar situations for years to come. The reports documented lessons learned about crowd control, communication strategies, and the importance of understanding the political and social context of public demonstrations, rather than treating them simply as potential criminal activity. Margaret carefully returned the demonstration files to their proper positions and moved to another section of the archives, where cases from the early 1970s waited in their orderly silence. These files reflected the evolution of police work as social attitudes changed and new types of crimes emerged that required different investigative approaches and community responses. A file from 1972 documented a complex fraud case involving a local business that had been selling fake insurance policies to elderly residents. Detective James Rodriguez had spent nearly a year investigating the scheme, documenting not just the criminal activity, but the social vulnerabilities that had made the fraud possible. His reports revealed careful attention to the ways that isolation and confusion could make elderly people targets for exploitation. The investigation had required coordination with state insurance regulators, federal agencies, and social service organizations that worked with elderly residents. Detective Rodriguez's reports documented his patient efforts to understand how the fraud had operated, identifying all the victims and developing evidence that could support both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts. The case resolution had involved not just arresting the perpetrators, but implementing new community education programs to help elderly residents identify and avoid similar scams. Detective Rodriguez had worked with senior citizen organizations to develop workshops about financial safety, creating ongoing protection against future fraud attempts rather than simply responding to the immediate criminal activity. These files from the 1970s reflected the increasing complexity of police work as social and economic changes created new types of crimes and required new approaches to community safety. The officers whose work was documented in these archives had adapted to these changes while maintaining the patient, thorough approach that characterized the best police work from any era. Margaret continued her careful movement through the archives, pausing occasionally to examine files that contained particularly comprehensive documentation or cases that had required unusual investigative approaches. The dust motes continued their slow dance through the fluorescent light, carrying with them the essence of decades of human stories that had been carefully preserved in these climate-controlled corridors. A case from 1974 involved a missing child who had been found safe after a search that had mobilized the entire community. 5-year-old Amanda Collins had wandered away from her backyard while playing and had become lost in the woods behind her neighborhood. The search had involved police officers, firefighters, volunteers, and even aircraft, but Amanda had ultimately been found by her own family dog, who had tracked her scent to a small cave where she had taken shelter. The documentation of Amanda's case included reports from dozens of different people who had participated in the search, creating a comprehensive record of how the community had responded to the crisis. The files contained maps showing search areas, communication logs documenting coordination between different agencies, and follow-up reports about changes in playground safety and child supervision that had resulted from lessons learned during the search. The archives also contained thank you letters from Amanda's family, written to the various people and organizations that had participated in the search effort. These letters were preserved alongside the official reports, creating a more complete picture of how police work connected to broader community relationships and mutual support systems. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret continued her patient work among the archives, maintaining the careful organization that made these historical records accessible to researchers and investigators who needed to reference past cases. Each file she handled represented hours of police work and community involvement, stories of human complexity that had been resolved through patience, investigation, and careful attention to both legal requirements and social context. The archives extended far beyond what any single person could examine in detail. But Margaret understood that her role was not to read every case, but to maintain the systems that preserved these stories for future reference. The filing cabinets held thousands of cases, each one representing a small but important piece of the community's ongoing history. A record of how people had learned to live together despite their differences and resolve conflicts through established legal and social processes. In the quiet of the basement archives, surrounded by decades of carefully preserved documentation, Margaret felt a deep connection to the officers and community members whose stories filled these files. Their patient work had created the foundation for modern police practice, establishing precedents and developing approaches that continued to influence law enforcement decades later. The dust settled gently on the filing cabinets, creating a patina that spoke of time and preservation rather than neglect. These archives represented more than just old paperwork. They were a testament to the ongoing human effort to maintain order and justice through careful attention to individual cases and community needs. Each file contained not just legal documentation, but wisdom about human nature and social dynamics that remained relevant, regardless of how much time had passed since the original investigations. As evening approached and the building above settled into its quieter rhythms, Margaret completed her work in the archives and prepared to return to the upper floors. The files would rest undisturbed until they were needed again, holding their stories with the same quiet dignity that characterized all properly maintained historical records. In the meantime, they served as a reminder that police work, at its best, was really about understanding people and preserving the delicate balance that made community life possible. Old Courthouse had been designed in an era when public buildings were meant to inspire reverence through their architecture, with high ceilings that drew the eye upward and marble columns that spoke of permanence and dignity. Night security guard Thomas Chun walked these corridors during the quiet hours when the building belonged to shadows and memory, his soft-soled shoes creating barely a whisper against the polished floors that reflected the emergency lighting in long, wavering lines during the day. These halls filled with the urgent business of justice, lawyers rushing between courtrooms, with briefcases full of evidence and argument, defendants waiting nervously on wooden benches that had supported the anxious weight of thousands of people over the decades, families clutching each other as they navigated the complex rituals of legal proceedings. But at night, the building settled into a different rhythm, one that allowed the accumulated history of human judgment to rest in peaceful silence. Thomas had worked the night shift at the courthouse for 12 years, arriving each evening as the last employees departed and the building began its transition from active workplace to monument of sleeping justice. He carried a large ring of keys that opened doors to courtrooms, chambers, offices, and storage areas that most people never saw. Spaces where the machinery of law, enforcement, and judicial process continued its patient work even when no one was present to observe. The basement of the courthouse contained holding cells that had been used for decades to house defendants awaiting trial or sentencing. Small rooms with thick walls and heavy doors that had witnessed more human drama than most people could imagine. These cells were rarely used now, as modern practice typically involved transporting defendants directly from the county jail for court appearances. But they remained as reminders of an earlier approach to criminal justice that had emphasized physical containment over rehabilitation. Thomas descended the marble staircase that led to the basement level, his flashlight beam dancing across walls that had been painted institutional green sometime in the 1960s, but had since faded to a gentler shade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air down here was cooler and carried the particular scent that came with age and careful maintenance, a mixture of cleaning supplies and the subtle mustiness that develops in spaces that are not frequently occupied. The first holding cell he passed had been designed to house up to 4 people, with a simple bench along one wall and a small window that looked out onto the courthouse parking lot. During the day, this window would allow natural light to filter into the otherwise austere space. but at night it served mainly to emphasize the isolation that defendants must have felt while waiting for their cases to be called. The cell door was heavy steel with a small window that allowed guards to observe occupants without entering the space. Thomas paused to examine the cell more closely, noting the careful construction that had been designed to ensure security while maintaining basic human dignity. The bench was built into the wall to prevent it from being used as a weapon, but it was positioned to allow occupants to look out the window or watch activity in the corridor. The walls showed signs of decades of use, with small scratches and worn spots that testified to the nervous energy of people who had waited here for their appointments, with Justice moving to the next cell. Thomas found evidence of the human stories that had played out in this space over the years. Someone had scratched initials into the paint on the wall, probably using a fingernail or the edge of a coin, creating a small monument to their presence in this place of temporary confinement. The letters were simple and unadorned, just two initials followed by a date from 1978, but they represented someone's need to mark their passage through this moment of legal uncertainty. The basement also contained interview rooms where defendants had met with their attorneys, small spaces with a table and two chairs where private conversations could take place away from the public areas of the courthouse. These rooms had thick walls and heavy doors to ensure confidentiality, creating environments where lawyers and clients could speak freely about strategy, evidence, and the complex calculations that determined how cases would be resolved. Thomas unlocked one of these interview rooms and stepped inside, noting the way the space seemed to hold echoes of thousands of conversations that had taken place within these walls. The table was scarred from years of use, marked by the rings left by coffee cups and the scratches made by pens and pencils as lawyers took notes during consultations. The chairs were simple but sturdy, designed to withstand constant use while providing basic comfort for meetings that might last several hours. The walls of the interview room were bare except for a small plaque that listed the rules governing attorney-client communications and the penalties for violating the confidentiality that these spaces were designed to protect. This simple text represented one of the fundamental principles of the legal system: the idea that effective defense required private communication between lawyers and their clients, even when those clients were accused of serious crimes. Returning to the corridor, Thomas continued his rounds through the basement level, checking each room and ensuring that all security systems were functioning properly. The basement had been designed as a secure area where defendants could be held and processed without disrupting the normal operations of the courthouse above. But it also served as a reminder of the human cost of crime and the complex emotions that surrounded every criminal case. The old courthouse had been built during an era when criminal justice was viewed differently than it was today, with more emphasis on punishment and less on rehabilitation or restorative justice. The holding cells reflected this philosophy, designed primarily for containment rather than treatment or education. Yet even within this framework, Thomas could see evidence of efforts to maintain human dignity and respect for the legal process that brought people to this place. Ascending to the main floor, Thomas began his patrol of the courtrooms themselves, large spaces with high ceilings and tall windows that had been designed to inspire respect for the legal process. The night emergency lighting cast long shadows across wooden benches that had been polished smooth by decades of use, creating an atmosphere that was both solemn and peaceful. Courtroom A was the largest space in the building, with seating for nearly 200 people and a raised platform where the judge's bench dominated the room like an altar of justice. During major trials, this room would fill with spectators, reporters, family members, and legal professionals, creating an atmosphere of focused attention on the drama of legal proceedings. But at night, the empty space seemed to hold the accumulated weight of every case that had been decided within these walls. Thomas walked slowly down the center aisle between the spectator benches, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast space above him. The judge's bench was made of dark wood that had been carved with symbols of justice and law, including scales, gavels, and the blindfolded figure that represented the impartial application of legal principles. These symbols had been created by craftsmen who understood that courtrooms were more than functional spaces. They were temples dedicated to the ideal of justice under law. The witness stand stood to the right of the judge's bench, a simple elevated chair where thousands of people had sworn to tell the truth before providing testimony that would influence the outcome of criminal and civil cases. The witness stand was positioned to allow the judge, jury, and attorneys to observe witnesses clearly, while also ensuring that witnesses could see and address the entire courtroom when providing their testimony. Thomas paused at the prosecution table, where district attorneys had presented evidence and argument in cases ranging from minor traffic violations to serious felonies. The table was large enough to accommodate multiple prosecutors and their assistants, with space for boxes of evidence, legal documents, and the technology needed for modern courtroom presentations. Yet the basic function of this space had remained unchanged since the courthouse was built. It was where the state presented its case against people accused of violating the law. The defense table occupied a similar position on the opposite side of the courtroom, providing equal space and resources for attorneys representing defendants. This physical equality was intended to symbolize the principle that defendants deserved vigorous representation, regardless of their ability to pay for legal services. The positioning of the tables ensured that both prosecution and defense had equal access to the judge and jury, reflecting the adversarial system that formed the foundation of American criminal justice. Moving to the jury box, Thomas examined the 12 chairs where citizens had deliberated on thousands of cases over the decades since the courthouse was built. These chairs had supported people from every walk of life as they struggled with the responsibility of determining guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented during trial. The jury box was positioned to provide clear views of the witness stand, the judge's bench, and both attorney tables, ensuring that jurors could observe all aspects of the proceedings. The jury deliberation room was located behind the courtroom, accessible through a door that could be locked to ensure privacy during the deliberation process. Thomas unlocked this door and examined the small space where juries retired to discuss the cases they had heard, making decisions that would determine the fate of defendants and the resolution of civil disputes. The room contained a simple conference table surrounded by 12 chairs, along with basic amenities that allowed jurors to spend extended periods deliberating complex cases. The walls of the jury room were blank, except for instructions about the deliberation process and reminders about the standards of evidence that jurors were expected to apply. These simple texts represented the culmination of centuries of legal development, distilling complex principles of justice into guidelines that ordinary citizens could understand and apply. The room had witnessed thousands of hours of discussion, argument, and careful consideration as juries worked to reach verdicts that would satisfy both legal requirements and their own sense of justice. Courtroom B was smaller than the main courtroom, but contained the same essential elements: judge's bench, witness stand, attorney tables, and seating for spectators and jury members. This space was typically used for less complex cases or preliminary hearings, but it maintained the same dignity and formal atmosphere that characterized all judicial proceedings. The night lighting created softer shadows here, giving the room a more intimate feeling while preserving the solemnity that was appropriate for legal proceedings. Thomas checked the security systems in each courtroom, ensuring that cameras and alarm systems were functioning properly to protect the valuable equipment and important documents that were stored in these spaces. Modern courtrooms contain sophisticated technology for recording proceedings, displaying evidence, and communicating with remote locations. But the fundamental purpose of these spaces remained unchanged: They were places where society's conflicts were resolved through the application of law rather than force. The courthouse also contained chambers where judges worked on cases outside of public view, private offices where they could research legal precedents, draft opinions, and meet with attorneys to discuss procedural matters. These chambers were smaller and more personal than the courtrooms, but they reflected the same attention to dignity and careful craftsmanship that characterized the public spaces. Judges' chambers typically contained extensive law libraries, with shelves of legal texts, case reports, and reference materials that judges consulted when making decisions about complex legal questions. These books represented the accumulated wisdom of legal tradition, providing guidance about how similar cases had been resolved in the past and establishing precedents that would influence future decisions. Thomas paused in one of the judge's chambers, noting the careful arrangement of books and documents that reflected years of judicial service. The desk was large and substantial, designed to accommodate the extensive paperwork that accompanied most legal cases. Family photographs and personal items provided small touches of humanity in a space that was otherwise dominated by the formal requirements of judicial service. The courthouse also contained offices for court clerks, bailiffs, and other personnel who supported the judicial process. These spaces were less formal than the courtrooms and chambers, but they reflected the same attention to functionality and dignity that characterized the entire building. Court clerks maintained the extensive records that documented every case, ensuring that legal proceedings were properly documented and that important deadlines were met. The bailiff's office contained equipment and materials needed to maintain security during court proceedings, including communication devices that allowed coordination with other law enforcement agencies when necessary. Bailiffs served as the physical presence of law enforcement within the courthouse, ensuring that proceedings could take place in an environment of safety and order. As Thomas continued his rounds through the courthouse, he reflected on the thousands of human stories that had played out within these walls over the decades since the building was constructed. Each courtroom had witnessed dramas of guilt and innocence, justice and mercy, conflict and resolution that represented the ongoing human struggle to live together under the rule of law, rather than the law of force. The courthouse also contained a law library that was open to the public during business hours, providing access to legal resources for people who needed to research their rights and responsibilities. This library represented the principle that justice required public access to legal information, ensuring that people could understand the laws that governed their lives and the procedures that would be used if they became involved in legal proceedings. The law library contained thousands of volumes documenting legal precedents, statutes, regulations, and commentary that formed the foundation of the American legal system. These books were carefully maintained and regularly updated to ensure that researchers had access to current information about legal developments. The library also contained computer terminals that provided access to online legal databases, reflecting the evolution of legal research in the digital age. Thomas completed his rounds in the courthouse basement, where additional storage areas contained archived case files and evidence that needed to be preserved for potential appeals or future reference. These storage areas were climate-controlled and secured to ensure that important documents and materials would remain available for as long as they might be needed by the legal system. The evidence storage area contained shelves and cabinets filled with materials from thousands of cases, carefully labeled and organized to allow quick retrieval when needed. Some of these items represented crucial evidence in serious criminal cases, while others were simple documents from routine civil proceedings. But all were maintained with the same attention to security and preservation. As the night progressed and Thomas completed his security rounds, the courthouse settled into its deepest quiet, holding within its walls the accumulated weight of decades of legal proceedings. The building served not just as a workplace for judges, lawyers, and court personnel, but as a monument to the principle that conflicts could be resolved through reason and law rather than violence and force. The empty courtrooms and silent corridors testified to the ongoing human effort to create systems of justice that could address the complex conflicts that arose from living in community with others. Each space within the courthouse had been designed to serve specific functions in this process. From the holding cells where defendants waited for their cases to be heard to the jury rooms where citizens deliberated on questions of guilt and innocence in the quiet of the night hours. The courthouse represented both the achievements and the limitations of human justice, a reminder that the legal system was an ongoing experiment in organizing society according to principles of fairness and equality, rather than power and privilege. The building would return to active life when morning came, filling again with the urgent business of legal proceedings. But for now it rested in peaceful contemplation of the serious responsibilities that would resume with the dawn. Detective Maria Santos had learned to read neighborhoods the way other people read books, understanding that every street told a story about the families who lived there and the invisible networks of relationship and responsibility that held communities together. She drove slowly through the Riverside district on this quiet Tuesday evening, noting the subtle signs that indicated how well residents knew each other and how comfortable they felt in their shared spaces. The houses along Maple Street had been built in the 1950s for young families starting their lives together after the war. Modest ranch homes with front yards large enough for children to play and back gardens where neighbors could chat over fence lines while tending their flowers and vegetables. Many of the original families had aged in place, creating a neighborhood where 3 generations might live within a few blocks of each other, connected by decades of shared history and mutual support. Detective Santos parked her patrol car beneath the old oak tree that dominated the corner of Maple and Elm, switching off the engine to listen to the subtle sounds that filled the evening air. Children's voices drifted from backyards where families were finishing dinner and beginning the rituals of homework and bedtime preparation. The gentle hum of air conditioning units mixed with the distant sound of television programming, creating the peaceful soundtrack of suburban life settling into its evening rhythm. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman lived in the White House with blue shutters at 1247 Maple Street, the same house where she had raised 4 children and cared for her husband during his long illness before his death 3 years earlier. At 78, she had become something of a neighborhood grandmother, the person that younger families turned to for advice about child rearing, gardening, and the small crises that arose in the course of daily life. Detective Santos had come to know Mrs. Hoffman through a series of minor incidents that had required police attention over the past several months, not because she was involved in any criminal activity, but because her house had become an unofficial community center where neighbors gathered to discuss concerns about safety, property maintenance, and the changes that were occurring as the neighborhood evolved from its original character. The most recent incident had involved teenagers using the vacant lot behind Mrs. Hoffman's house as a gathering place during evening hours, leaving behind evidence of drinking and minor vandalism that had concerned several residents. Rather than simply dispersing the teenagers or issuing citations, Detective Santos had worked with Mrs. Hoffman and other neighbors to understand why the young people were attracted to this particular location and what needs they were trying to meet through their informal gatherings. The investigation had revealed that the teenagers, most of whom lived in the neighborhood or nearby areas, were simply looking for a place where they could socialize without adult supervision, while remaining relatively close to home. The vacant lot provided privacy and accessibility, but it also created concerns about noise, litter, and the potential for more serious problems to develop if the situation was not addressed. Thoughtfully, Mrs. Hoffman had surprised many people by suggesting that the teenagers be invited to participate in finding a solution, rather than simply being told to move their activities elsewhere. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to remember when today's concerned parents had been teenagers themselves, gathering in similar informal groups and occasionally causing similar concerns among the adults who lived nearby. Working with Detective Santos, Mrs. Hoffman had organized a meeting between neighborhood residents and the teenagers, creating an opportunity for different generations to communicate about their needs and concerns. The teenagers had explained that they appreciated having a place to meet friends and talk about school, relationships, and future plans without feeling judged or supervised by adults who might not understand their perspectives. The residents had expressed their concerns about noise levels, property damage, and the example that unsupervised teenage gatherings might set for younger children in the neighborhood. Both groups had legitimate interests, but they had been operating from assumptions about each other's motivations rather than engaging in direct communication about how to balance different needs. The solution that emerged from these discussions reflected Mrs. Hoffman's understanding of how neighborhoods functioned as extended families rather than collections of isolated households. The teenagers were invited to use the community center during certain evening hours, providing them with supervised space for socializing while also connecting them with adult mentors who could provide guidance about educational and career opportunities. Detective Santos documented this resolution in her reports, recognizing that successful police work often involved facilitating communication between different groups, rather than simply enforcing rules about acceptable behavior. The case had required patience and creativity, but it had also strengthened the social connections that made the neighborhood safer and more supportive for everyone who lived there. Moving down Elm Street, Detective Santos paused at the house where the Morrison family had been dealing with challenges related to caring for elderly relatives while maintaining their own family responsibilities. Robert Morrison worked as a supervisor at the local manufacturing plant, while his wife Linda managed a part-time job and the complex logistics of caring for Robert's mother, who had been living with them since suffering a stroke that limited her independence. The Morrison family had come to police attention several months earlier when neighbors reported loud arguments that seemed to occur with increasing frequency during evening hours. Detective Santos had responded to these calls with understanding that domestic disputes often reflected underlying stresses rather than simple conflicts between family members who didn't get along. While her investigation had revealed that the Morrison family was struggling with the common challenge of providing adequate care for an elderly family member while maintaining their own emotional and financial stability. Robert's mother required assistance with daily activities like bathing, medication management, and meal preparation, but she also needed social interaction and mental stimulation to maintain her overall health and well-being. The arguments that neighbors had overheard typically occurred when family members were exhausted from work and caregiving responsibilities, leading to conflicts about household management, financial decisions, and the division of caregiving duties. These disputes reflected love and concern rather than animosity, but they created stress for everyone involved and occasionally became loud enough to concern neighbors who worried about the family's welfare. Detective Santos had worked with the Morrison family to connect them with county social services that provided support for families caring for elderly relatives. These services included respite care that allowed family caregivers to have occasional breaks from their responsibilities, along with educational programs that helped families understand how to provide effective care while maintaining their own physical and emotional health. *. The resolution had involved not just social services but also informal support from neighbors who understood the challenges that the Morrison family was facing. Mrs. Patterson from next door had offered to sit with Robert's mother occasionally so that Robert and Linda could have evening time together, while other neighbors had organized a meal delivery schedule during particularly stressful periods. Detective Santos continued her patrol through the neighborhood, noting how these informal networks of mutual support created the foundation for community safety and stability. Police work in residential areas often involved understanding these relationships and finding ways to strengthen them rather than simply responding to problems after they had escalated to the point where official intervention was necessary. The house at 1156 Elm Street had been the site of a burglary 6 months earlier, when someone had broken in during daytime hours while the Chun family was at work and school. The incident had been solved relatively quickly when the burglar, a teenager from a nearby neighborhood, had been caught trying to sell stolen items at a local pawn shop. But the emotional impact on the Chun family had lasted much longer than the criminal investigation. Mrs. Chun had called Detective Santos several times in the weeks following the burglary, not to report additional crimes, but to discuss her concerns about home security and her family's sense of safety in their neighborhood. The break-in had violated the sense of privacy and security that people needed to feel comfortable in their homes, creating anxiety that persisted even after the stolen items had been recovered and the burglar had been arrested. Detective Santos had worked with the Chun family to address these concerns through both practical and emotional approaches. She had provided information about home security improvements, including better locks, lighting, and alarm systems that could reduce the likelihood of future break-ins. More importantly, she had helped the family understand that their reaction to the burglary was normal and that their sense of security would gradually return as time passed and no additional incidents occurred. The resolution had involved the entire neighborhood in efforts to improve collective security through increased communication and mutual awareness. Neighbors had organized informal watch networks, agreeing to keep an eye on each other's homes during work hours and to report any suspicious activity to police. They had also improved lighting and visibility around houses, making the area less attractive to potential burglars who preferred to work in areas where their activities would not be easily observed. Detective Santos pulled into the parking area behind the elementary school where many neighborhood children attended classes, noting how the school served as another focal point for community relationships and shared concerns. Parents gathered here twice daily for student drop-off and pickup, creating natural opportunities for communication about neighborhood issues and mutual support for families dealing with similar challenges. The school had been the site of several minor incidents over the past year, including vandalism that had required police investigation and coordination with school administrators to develop appropriate responses. The vandalism had been committed by students who were expressing frustration about school policies and social pressures, rather than engaging in malicious destruction. But it had still required careful handling to address both the immediate property damage and the underlying concerns that had motivated the destructive behavior. Detective Santos had worked with school officials to develop educational programs that provided students with constructive channels for expressing concerns about school policies and social issues. These programs had included student government initiatives, peer mediation training, and community service projects that allowed young people to contribute positively to their school and neighborhood environments. The partnerships between police, school officials, and families had created a comprehensive approach to youth development that addressed potential problems before they escalated to the point where formal disciplinary action was necessary. Students learned about legal responsibilities and community citizenship, while also receiving support for the personal and social challenges that were part of normal adolescent development. Driving through the commercial district that served the neighborhood, Detective Santos noted how local businesses contributed to community stability. through their relationships with residential families and their attention to maintaining safe, welcoming environments for customers. Morrison's hardware store had been family-owned for 3 generations, creating continuity and personal relationships that helped business owners understand and respond to changing neighborhood needs. The hardware store had been the site of shoplifting incidents that reflected broader economic pressures affecting some neighborhood families rather than deliberate criminal behavior. Detective Santos had worked with store management to develop responses that addressed both immediate theft concerns and underlying financial difficulties that motivated people to steal items they could not afford to purchase. The solutions had included payment plans for expensive items, job referral programs for people seeking employment, and partnerships with social service agencies that could provide emergency assistance for families experiencing temporary financial crises. These approaches had reduced shoplifting incidents while also strengthening the store's relationships with customers who appreciated the understanding and flexibility that management showed toward people facing difficult circumstances. Detective Santos concluded her patrol at the community center where neighborhood residents gathered for social activities, educational programs, and meetings about local concerns. The center served as headquarters for many of the informal networks that maintained community stability, hosting everything from senior citizen lunch programs to youth sports leagues to political forums, where residents could discuss local government issues. The community center had occasionally been the site of conflicts between different groups who used the facility, requiring police mediation when disagreements about scheduling, policies, or appropriate activities could not be resolved through normal administrative channels. These conflicts typically reflected different perspectives about community priorities rather than personal animosity, but they still required careful handling to preserve the center's role as a neutral gathering place for all residents. Detective Santos had learned that successful resolution of community center conflicts required understanding the underlying values and concerns that motivated different groups rather than simply arbitrating disputes about specific policies or procedures. Senior citizens valued quiet activities and intergenerational programs that connected them with younger residents, while families with children needed active recreational opportunities and educational support services. Young adults and teenagers appreciated programs that provided job training, college preparation, and social activities that helped them develop leadership skills and community connections. Each group had legitimate needs, but balancing these different interests required ongoing communication and compromise rather than simple administrative decisions about resource allocation. The evening had grown quiet as Detective Santos completed her patrol, with most families settled into their homes for dinner and evening activities. The neighborhood seemed peaceful and secure, but she understood that this apparent tranquility reflected the ongoing work of many people who contributed to community stability through their daily attention to relationships, responsibilities, and mutual support. Police work in residential neighborhoods required understanding that crime prevention was really about community building, creating environments where people felt connected to each other and responsible for collective welfare. The most effective law enforcement often involved facilitating communication, providing resources for people facing challenges, and strengthening the informal networks that helped neighborhoods function as extended families rather than collections of isolated households. The families who lived in these houses represented the foundation of community stability. People who had chosen to invest their time, energy, and resources in creating safe, supportive environments for themselves and their neighbors. Their daily efforts to maintain homes, raise children, care for elderly relatives, and contribute to local institutions created the social fabric that made formal law enforcement both possible and less frequently necessary. Detective Santos understood that her role was to support and strengthen these community efforts rather than to replace them with formal police interventions. The most successful cases she handled were those where police resources complemented existing community strengths rather than substituting for relationships and responsibilities that residents needed to maintain themselves. As she drove back toward the station, Detective Santos reflected on how much she had learned about effective police work through her experiences in neighborhoods like Riverside. The families who lived there had taught her that safety and security were really about trust, communication, and mutual responsibility rather than surveillance, enforcement, and punishment. These lessons influenced her approach to every case, helping her understand that the goal of police work was to preserve and strengthen communities rather than simply to arrest people who violated laws. Sergeant David Kim had grown accustomed to the particular rhythm of the night shift. The way the police station settled into a different kind of productivity after the day watch departed and the building entered its quieter phase of operations. The fluorescent lights hummed with their familiar electrical whisper, casting steady illumination across dispatch desks, filing cabinets, and the rows of reports that accumulated throughout each shift like sediment depositing layers of human experience. The night shift operated with a smaller staff than the day watch, creating an atmosphere of careful concentration where each officer understood their role in maintaining the continuity of police service during the hours when most of the city slept. The radio dispatchers maintained their vigilant attention to emergency frequencies, ready to coordinate responses to the occasional calls that came in during the quiet hours, while patrol officers drove their assigned routes through neighborhoods and commercial districts that had settled into nocturnal stillness. Sergeant Kim moved slowly through the station, checking on the various activities that continued throughout the night. The booking area remained ready for the occasional arrest that might require processing, though the cells were currently empty and the intake procedures that dominated evening hours had given way to the more reflective tasks of report writing and case follow-up that characterized the deepest hours of each shift. Officer Patricia Martinez sat at her desk in the report room, working through a stack of case files that required updated documentation before they could be forwarded to detectives for further investigation. Her typewriter created a gentle percussion that mixed with the ambient sounds of the station, the steady rhythm of keys striking paper and carbon copies, serving as a kind of meditation that helped focus her attention on the precise language required for police documentation. The case she was currently documenting involved a series of bicycle thefts that had occurred near the high school over the past several weeks. Incidents that individually seemed minor, but collectively suggested a pattern that deserved attention from investigators. Officer Martinez typed carefully, describing each incident with the detail necessary to help detectives understand whether the thefts were connected and what approaches might be most effective for preventing future occurrences. Her report noted that the stolen bicycles had all been taken during school hours from areas where students typically left their bikes while attending classes. The thefts showed signs of planning and knowledge about school schedules, suggesting that the perpetrator was familiar with the routines that governed student activities and the security measures that were in place to protect student property. Officer Martinez had interviewed several students whose bicycles had been stolen, documenting their descriptions of the bikes and the circumstances under which the thefts had occurred. These interviews had revealed that students often left their bicycles in relatively isolated areas where they would not interfere with pedestrian traffic or school activities. But these same locations provided opportunities for theft that were difficult to prevent. Through normal security measures, the investigation had also revealed that some students were leaving expensive bicycles inadequately secured, using cable locks that could be easily defeated, or sometimes leaving bikes completely unlocked during short absences from class. Officer Martinez documented these security vulnerabilities, while also noting that the students' behavior reflected the general sense of safety and trust that characterized the school environment rather than carelessness or disregard for their property. As she typed the final paragraphs of the bicycle theft report, Officer Martinez reflected on how many similar cases she had documented during her 5 years on the night shift. Each report represented someone's personal loss and inconvenience, but the cumulative effect of thorough documentation was to create patterns that could guide prevention efforts and help investigators understand how different types of crime operated within the community. The next case in her queue involved a vandalism incident at Morrison Park, where someone had used spray paint to create graffiti on several picnic tables and the side of the restroom building. The vandalism had been discovered by park maintenance workers during their morning routine, but Officer Martinez's investigation suggested that the graffiti had been created during the previous evening when the park was empty of legitimate users. The graffiti itself was not particularly sophisticated, consisting mainly of initials and simple designs that suggested teenage authorship rather than organized gang activity or political messaging. Officer Martinez had photographed each example of the vandalism, documenting its location and characteristics in case similar graffiti appeared elsewhere in the city and could be connected to this incident. Her investigation had included conversations with neighbors who lived near the park, seeking information about any unusual activity they might have observed during the evening hours when the vandalism was likely to have occurred. Several residents reported seeing teenagers in the park after dark, but none had observed the actual creation of graffiti or could provide descriptions detailed enough to identify specific individuals. The resolution of the park vandalism case had involved both immediate cleanup efforts and longer-term prevention strategies that addressed the underlying attractions that drew young people to the park during unsupervised hours. Park officials had improved lighting in areas where vandalism had occurred, while also creating designated spaces where teenagers could gather for legitimate recreational activities without feeling that they were trespassing or violating park rules. Officer Martinez completed her documentation of the park vandalism case and pulled another file from the stack on her desk, this one dealing with a noise complaint that had required multiple visits to resolve. The complaint involved a house where college students were living in a residential neighborhood, creating conflicts between their lifestyle preferences and the expectations of established residents who valued quiet during evening hours. The initial noise complaint had been filed by Mrs. Anderson, who lived next door to the rental house and had been awakened repeatedly by loud music and conversations that continued late into the night. Officer Martinez had responded to this complaint several times over the course of a month, each visit revealing additional complexity in the situation that required patient communication rather than simple enforcement of noise ordinances. The college students had been genuinely surprised to learn that their activities were disturbing neighbors, explaining that they were accustomed to dormitory living where late-night socializing was considered normal and acceptable. They had not considered how their behavior might affect people who were not part of their peer group and who had different schedules and lifestyle preferences. Mrs. Anderson had initially been frustrated with what she perceived as deliberate disrespect for neighborhood norms, but Officer Martinez's patient mediation had helped her understand that the students' behavior reflected inexperience with residential living rather than malicious intent. The students had apologized for the disturbance and expressed willingness to modify their behavior to accommodate their neighbors' needs for quiet during sleeping hours. The resolution had involved establishing clear guidelines about acceptable noise levels and hours, with the students agreeing to end outdoor activities by 10 p.m. on weeknights and midnight on weekends. Mrs. Anderson had agreed to communicate directly with the students about any future concerns before calling police, while the students had provided their phone number so that neighbors could contact them immediately if problems arose. Officer Martinez documented this resolution in her report, noting how successful community policing often required facilitating communication between people who had different lifestyles and expectations, but shared common interests in maintaining peaceful neighborhood environments. The case had required multiple visits and extensive conversation, but it had resulted in improved relationships between neighbors who might otherwise have remained in conflict. Asterisk across the room. Detective Robert Chun worked on follow-up investigations for cases that had been initiated during previous shifts, using the quiet hours of the night watch to conduct research and analysis that required sustained concentration. The night shift provided opportunities for this kind of detailed, investigative work that was often difficult to accomplish during busier periods when officers were constantly responding to new calls and immediate crises. Detective Chun was currently reviewing financial records related to a fraud case that involved an elderly resident who had been victimized by someone claiming to represent a home improvement company. The case required careful analysis of bank records, contracts, and communication records to understand how the fraud had operated and to identify the perpetrators who had taken advantage of the victim's trust and confusion. The investigation had revealed that the fraud was part of a larger scheme that targeted elderly residents throughout the region, using high-pressure sales tactics and deliberately confusing contract language to convince people to pay for home improvements that were either unnecessary or grossly overpriced. Detective Chun's analysis of financial records had identified patterns that connected this local case to similar incidents in neighboring jurisdictions. His work during the night shift involved coordinating with detectives and other police departments to share information about the fraud scheme and to develop strategies for identifying and arresting the perpetrators. This coordination required extensive phone calls and email communication during hours when investigators in different time zones were available to discuss their cases and share relevant information. Detective Chen also used the quiet hours to conduct online research about similar fraud schemes that had been reported in other parts of the country, looking for information about investigative techniques that had been successful in other cases and for patterns that might help predict where the perpetrators would target their next victims. The night shift allowed for this kind of comprehensive investigation that required sustained attention and coordination with multiple agencies, work that would be difficult to accomplish during busier periods when detectives were constantly interrupted by new cases and immediate responsibilities. Detective Chun found satisfaction in the methodical progress that was possible during these quiet hours, when he could focus completely on understanding complex criminal schemes and developing effective responses. The station's evidence room remained active during the night shift, with evidence technician Lisa Wong maintaining the careful organization and documentation that ensured the integrity of materials that might be needed for court proceedings months or even years after their initial collection. The evidence room operated under strict protocols that govern how materials were stored, accessed, and transferred to ensure that nothing would be lost or contaminated in ways that might compromise its value for prosecution. Evidence technician Wong spent her night shift hours updating inventory records, organizing storage areas, and preparing evidence packages for cases that were scheduled for court hearings during the following weeks. This work required meticulous attention to detail and careful adherence to procedures that had been developed to maintain the chain of custody that was essential for using physical evidence in criminal prosecutions. The evidence room contained thousands of items from cases that spanned several decades, ranging from photographs and documents to weapons and stolen property that had been recovered during investigations. Each item was carefully labeled and stored according to protocols that considered its size, composition, potential degradation over time, and the likelihood that it would be needed for future legal proceedings. Evidence technician Wong also maintained communication with prosecutors and defense attorneys who needed access to evidence for case preparation, coordinating schedules, and ensuring that all requests were properly documented and authorized. This communication often occurred during night shift hours when legal professionals were preparing for the following day's court proceedings and needed immediate access to specific materials. The careful organization of the evidence room reflected the broader attention to documentation and procedure that characterized all aspects of police work during the night shift. Every action was recorded, every decision was documented, and every piece of evidence was handled according to established protocols that ensured its integrity and availability for the legal processes that might require its use. Radio dispatcher Maria Santos maintained constant vigilance over the communication systems that connected patrol officers with the station and coordinated responses to the emergency calls that occasionally interrupted the quiet rhythm of night shift operations. Her position required sustained concentration and immediate readiness to handle any situation that might develop during the hours when most supervisory personnel were not available to provide guidance. Dispatcher Santos monitored multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, staying alert for any transmissions that might indicate officers needed assistance or that emergency situations were developing that required coordinated responses. The radio room was equipped with backup communication systems and emergency protocols that ensured continuity of operations even if primary systems failed during critical situations. During the quiet periods between radio calls, Dispatcher Santos updated activity logs and reviewed procedures for handling different types of emergency situations that might occur during night shift hours. This preparation was essential for ensuring effective responses to incidents that could develop rapidly and require immediate coordination between multiple officers and agencies. The night shift dispatcher also maintained communication with dispatchers in neighboring jurisdictions, sharing information about incidents that might affect multiple communities and coordinating responses to situations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. This regional coordination was particularly important during night hours when fewer supervisory personnel were available to handle complex multi-jurisdictional situations. As the night progressed toward its deepest hours, the station settled into its most reflective rhythm, with each staff member focused on their specific responsibilities while maintaining awareness of their role in the larger system of public safety that continued to operate even when most of the community was asleep. The steady sounds of typing, radio communication, and quiet conversation created a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted with the urgency that would characterize the station during busier periods. Sergeant Kim completed his rounds through the station, checking on each area where night shift personnel were working and ensuring that all systems were functioning properly. The quiet efficiency of night shift operations reflected years of experience and training that allowed a small staff to maintain full police services during hours when emergency situations could develop without warning. The clock on the station wall continued its steady measurement of time, marking the progression of night shift hours with a rhythm that seemed to slow as midnight approached and the city settled into its deepest sleep. The officers and staff who maintained this vigil understood that their work during these quiet hours provided the foundation for community safety and security that most residents took for granted. In the peaceful concentration of night shift operations, each task contributed to the larger mission of preserving order and responding to the human needs that could arise at any hour. Reports were documented with care, evidence was preserved with precision, and communication systems were maintained with vigilance. all part of the patient work that continued through the night to ensure that morning would find the community safe and secure. The night shift represented law enforcement at its most contemplative, when the urgent demands of emergency response gave way to the careful attention to detail and procedure that created the foundation for effective police work. In these quiet hours, the true character of police service was revealed through the dedication of people who chose to spend their nights protecting others while most of the world slept in peaceful trust that morning would bring safety and order. The photography lab in the basement of the precinct operated in perpetual twilight, with red filtered lights casting everything in the warm amber glow that protected developing film from exposure while creating an atmosphere of quiet concentration. Crime scene photographer Jennifer Walsh had spent countless hours in this space over her 12-year career, transforming the raw documentation of crime scenes into the carefully processed images that would serve as permanent records of events that could never be recreated or revisited. Each photograph represented a moment frozen in time, a fragment of reality preserved with scientific precision for examination by investigators, attorneys, and juries who needed to understand exactly what had been found at locations where crimes had occurred. The developing process required patience and attention to detail, qualities that had made Jennifer particularly suited for work that demanded both technical skill and deep respect for the significance of the images she created. The darkroom contained enlargers, chemical baths, and drying racks that had been used to process thousands of photographs over the years, creating an archive of visual documentation that complemented the written reports and physical evidence that filled the department's storage areas. Each image was processed according to strict protocols that ensured accurate representation of crime scenes while maintaining the chain of custody that would be necessary if the photographs were used in legal proceedings. Jennifer worked methodically through a batch of film from a burglary case that had been investigated the previous week, carefully developing each frame to capture the details that might prove significant during the investigation process. The photograph showed the interior of a house where someone had searched through drawers and closets, looking for valuable items while leaving behind evidence of their presence and methods. The developing process revealed details that had not been immediately apparent at the crime scene, subtle indications of how the burglar had entered the house and which items had attracted their attention. Fingerprint powder on surfaces showed where investigators had searched for evidence, while the careful arrangement of household items revealed the burglar's systematic approach to searching for valuable property. One photograph showed a jewelry box that had been emptied but left in place on a bedroom dresser, positioned exactly as the homeowner had arranged it except for the absence of the valuable items it had contained. The careful framing of this image captured not just the evidence of theft, but the violation of personal space that made burglary particularly traumatic for victims who returned home to find their private possessions disturbed by strangers. Another image documented the point of entry where the burglar had forced open a back door, showing the splintered wood and damaged lock that had allowed access to the house. The photograph was taken from multiple angles to show both the exterior and interior damage, providing investigators with visual evidence that could be used to understand the burglar's tools and techniques. Jennifer moved to the next set of photographs, these from a vandalism case where someone had used spray paint to create graffiti on the side of a downtown building. The images showed the artistic quality of the work alongside the property damage it represented, capturing the tension between creative expression and legal violation that characterized many vandalism cases involving young people. The photographs had been taken during different lighting conditions to ensure that all details of the graffiti would be visible in the final images. Daylight shots showed the overall composition and its relationship to the surrounding architecture, while photographs taken with supplemental lighting revealed details of technique and individual brushstrokes that might help identify the artist if similar work appeared elsewhere in the city. One particularly striking image showed how the graffiti incorporated existing architectural features of the building, using a window frame as part of the overall design and working with the natural texture of the brick wall rather than simply covering it with paint. The photograph captured the artistic sophistication of the work while documenting the extent of property damage that would need to be considered during prosecution. The developing process for vandalism photographs required special attention to color accuracy, as the specific shades and combinations of paint used could provide important clues about the materials and techniques employed by the vandal. Jennifer used color correction filters and carefully controlled chemical processing to ensure that the developed photographs would accurately represent the original appearance of the graffiti. Moving to another enlarger, Jennifer worked on photographs from a domestic violence case where the images would document physical evidence that supported the victim's account of what had occurred during the incident. These photographs required particularly sensitive handling, as they would be used to help prosecute a crime that involved intimate personal relationships and complex emotional dynamics. The images showed damage to furniture and walls that had occurred during the violent incident, along with photographs of injuries that had been sustained by the victim. Jennifer processed these images with special care, understanding that they would be examined by people who needed to understand the severity of the violence, while also being used in a legal context that required absolute accuracy in representation. One photograph showed a damaged picture frame that had been broken during the incident, with family photographs scattered on the floor around it. The image captured not just the physical evidence of violence, but the emotional destruction that domestic abuse created in the intimate spaces where families should feel safe and secure. Another image documented bruising and other injuries that the victim had sustained, photographed according to medical protocols that ensured accurate documentation of their extent and appearance. These photographs would be crucial for prosecution of the case, providing objective evidence that supported the victim's testimony about what had occurred during the violent incident. The processing of domestic violence photographs required Jennifer to maintain professional detachment while handling images that represented profound human suffering and trauma. She had learned to focus on the technical aspects of photography and development while maintaining appropriate respect for the people whose pain was documented in these images. The darkroom also contained photographs from vehicle accident investigations, cases where precise documentation of damage patterns and debris distribution could help investigators understand how collisions had occurred and whether criminal charges were appropriate. These images required careful attention to scale and perspective, ensuring that measurements and spatial relationships would be accurately represented. Jennifer worked on photographs from a hit-and-run investigation where someone had struck a pedestrian and left the scene without providing assistance or identification. The images showed damage to the victim's bicycle and personal belongings, along with debris from the striking vehicle that had been left at the scene and could potentially be used to identify the responsible driver. One photograph showed paint transfer on the victim's bicycle where it had been struck by the fleeing vehicle, with the color and texture carefully documented to assist investigators in identifying the make and model of the car involved in the accident. The image was processed with special attention to color accuracy and detail, resolution that would allow forensic experts to make precise comparisons with suspected vehicles. Another image documented the pattern of debris distribution at the accident scene, showing how pieces of broken headlight and other vehicle components had been scattered across the roadway. The photograph used measurement markers to provide scale references that would allow investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events that had occurred during the collision. The photographs from traffic accident investigations often revealed details that had not been apparent during the initial response to the incident, subtle evidence that became significant only after careful examination and analysis. Jennifer's role was to ensure that these details were preserved with sufficient clarity and accuracy to support whatever investigative conclusions might be drawn from the visual evidence. As she worked through the evening's developing tasks, Jennifer reflected on how photography had evolved during her career, with digital technology beginning to supplement the traditional film processing that still formed the foundation of crime scene documentation. Digital cameras offered immediate results and easier reproduction of images, but film photography remained important for cases where absolute authenticity and admissibility in court were crucial considerations. The darkroom represented a bridge between the immediate reality of crime scenes and the careful analysis that would occur months later during legal proceedings. The photographs that Jennifer developed would be examined by people who had not been present at the original scenes, requiring absolute accuracy in representation and careful attention to details that might prove significant during investigation and prosecution. Moving to a different and larger, Jennifer worked on photographs from a fraud investigation where documents had been altered to misrepresent financial transactions. The images required special techniques to reveal details of erasures, overwriting, and other alterations that might not be visible under normal lighting conditions. The photographs showed checks and contracts where original writing had been modified to change amounts, dates, and other crucial information. Jennifer used specialized lighting and filters to enhance the visibility of these alterations, creating images that would allow handwriting experts and forensic accountants to analyze the methods used to commit the fraud. One particularly complex image showed a contract where several different types of alterations had been made, with some changes involving complete replacement of text and others involving subtle modifications to individual letters and numbers. The photograph required multiple exposures with different lighting angles to capture all the relevant details in a single comprehensive image. Asterisk. The processing of fraud case photographs required collaboration with investigators who understood the legal significance of different types of documentary evidence and could guide the photographic documentation to ensure that all relevant details were preserved for analysis. Jennifer worked closely with detectives to understand which aspects of altered documents were most important for prosecution of the case. The darkroom also contained a collection of historical photographs from cases that had been resolved years earlier but remained significant for training purposes and as examples of investigative techniques that had been successful in similar situations. These older images provided visual documentation of how crime scene photography had evolved and improved over the decades. Jennifer often consulted these historical photographs when working on current cases, looking for examples of how similar evidence had been documented in the past and learning from techniques that had proven effective for different types of crime scenes. The accumulated experience represented in these images formed a valuable resource for improving current photographic practices. One series of historical photographs documented a major fraud case from the 1970s were altered. Financial records had been used to embezzle funds from a local business. The images showed the careful photographic techniques that had been used to reveal document alterations using the technology available at that time, providing insights into methods that remained relevant for modern fraud investigations. Another collection showed crime scene photographs from a burglary ring that had been active during the 1980s, with images that documented the consistent methods and tools used by the perpetrators across multiple incidents. The photographs had been crucial for establishing the connections between different crimes and identifying patterns that had led to the eventual arrest and conviction of the responsible individuals. As the night progressed, Jennifer completed her work on the current batch of photographs and began organizing the developed images for distribution to the appropriate investigators and prosecutors. Each photograph was carefully labeled and cataloged according to case number, date, and subject matter, ensuring that the images would be easily accessible when needed. For legal proceedings, The developed photographs would be stored in acid-free envelopes and filing systems that provided protection from deterioration, while maintaining easy access for people who needed to examine the images during investigation and prosecution of the cases. The storage system included duplicate copies of crucial photographs, ensuring that important evidence would not be lost if original images were damaged or misplaced. Jennifer also prepared photographic enlargements for cases where specific details needed to be examined more closely, creating images that would allow investigators and experts to analyze evidence that might not be visible in standard-sized photographs. These enlargements required careful attention to focus and exposure to ensure that magnification did not introduce distortions that might affect the accuracy of analysis. The final task of her evening involved updating the photographic logs that documented all images processed during each shift, creating records that would be essential for maintaining the chain of custody and ensuring that all evidence was properly accounted for during legal proceedings. These logs included detailed information about processing techniques, chemical batches, and timing that would be necessary if questions arose about the authenticity or accuracy of the posi photographs. In the quiet concentration of the darkroom, surrounded by the gentle sounds of chemical processing and the soft glow of safety lighting, Jennifer understood that her work formed a crucial link between the immediate reality of crime scenes and the careful analysis that would determine how cases were resolved. Each photograph represented a permanent record of evidence that could never be recreated, making accuracy and attention to detail essential for ensuring that justice could be served. The photographs she developed would become part of the permanent archive of criminal investigation, joining thousands of other images that documented the patient work of law enforcement and the complex human situations that required intervention by the criminal justice system. In the amber light of the darkroom, these images rested in chemical baths that would preserve them for decades, ensuring that the evidence they contained would remain available for as long as it might be needed. Detective William Harrison walked slowly along Riverside Avenue as the evening settled into its deeper rhythms, noting how the familiar landscape held layers of history that were invisible to casual observers but revealed themselves to someone who had spent decades investigating the human dramas that had unfolded in these ordinary spaces. Each building, each intersection, each small park contained memories of cases that had once demanded urgent attention, but now rested in the peaceful accumulation of time and resolution. The brick apartment building at 412 Riverside Avenue looked unremarkable in the gentle light of early evening, its windows glowing with the warm illumination of families settling into their nightly routines. But Detective Harrison remembered when this same building had been the center of an investigation that had consumed weeks of careful detective work, a missing person case that had revealed the complex relationships and hidden tensions that existed within what appeared to be a quiet residential community. Mrs. Dorothy Kim had lived in apartment 3B for 15 years when she disappeared on a Tuesday morning in March 1985, leaving behind no note, no indication of her plans, and no explanation for an absence that was completely out of character for someone whose life followed predictable patterns of work, shopping, and social activities. The investigation had required Detective Harrison to understand not just the facts of her disappearance, but the intricate network of relationships that connected residents of the building and the neighborhood around it. The case had been resolved 6 weeks later when Mrs. Kim was found living in a small town 300 miles away, caring for a sister whose sudden illness had required immediate attention. The urgency of the family crisis had prevented Mrs. Kim from following her normal procedures for notifying her employer, her neighbors, and the various people who depended on her regular presence in their daily routines. She had simply packed a small bag and left immediately, intending to return within a few days, but finding that her sister's condition required extended care. Detective Harrison had learned important lessons about community connections through Mrs. Kim's case, understanding how the disappearance of one person could create ripples of concern and disruption that affected dozens of other people who relied on the stability and predictability that characterized neighborhood life. The investigation had revealed the extent to which residents depended on informal networks of mutual awareness and support that often went unrecognized until someone was absent from their expected place in the community fabric. Walking past the building now, Detective Harrison could remember the relief that had accompanied Mrs. Kim's safe return, and the way her temporary absence had strengthened the connections between neighbors who had been drawn together by their shared concern for her welfare. The case had demonstrated how investigations could sometimes reveal positive aspects of community life rather than simply documenting problems and violations. The small park at the corner of Riverside and Oak Street appeared peaceful in the evening light, with its well-maintained playground equipment and carefully tended flower beds creating an environment that welcomed families and provided a gathering place for informal social interactions. But Detective Harrison remembered when this same park had been the site of vandalism that had required careful investigation to understand the motivations and social dynamics that had led to destructive behavior. During the summer of 1982, someone had been damaging playground equipment and defacing the gazebo with spray paint, creating problems that went beyond simple property damage to threaten the sense of safety and community ownership that made the park valuable for neighborhood families. The investigation had taken several months to resolve, not because the vandalism was particularly sophisticated, but because Detective Harrison had wanted to understand the underlying causes, rather than simply arresting the perpetrators. The case had eventually revealed that the vandalism was being committed by teenagers who felt excluded from the park because of their age and appearance. Young people who believed that the space was intended only for families with small children, and that they were unwelcome in what was supposed to be a community resource. Their destructive behavior had been a misguided attempt to assert their right to use public space rather than malicious destruction of property. The resolution had involved community meetings where teenagers and families had discussed how the park could accommodate different age groups and activities without creating conflicts or safety concerns. The result had been the creation of designated areas for different types of recreational activities, along with programming that provided constructive outlets for teenage energy and creativity. Detective Harrison had documented this case as an example of how effective police work often involved facilitating communication between different community groups rather than simply enforcing laws about property damage and public behavior. The park now served as a model for how public spaces could accommodate diverse community needs through careful planning and ongoing dialogue between residents with different perspectives and interests. Continuing his walk through the neighborhood, Detective Harrison paused at the intersection of Oak Street and Maple Avenue, where a traffic accident in 1979 had led to an investigation that revealed important information about road safety and community responsibility. A child had been struck by a car while crossing the street on her way to school, sustaining injuries that required hospitalization, but ultimately recovering completely from the accident. The investigation had focused not just on the immediate circumstances of the accident, but on the broader patterns of traffic and pedestrian behavior that had created the conditions where such an incident could occur. Detective Harrison had conducted extensive observations of the intersection during school hours, documenting how children crossed the street and how drivers responded to the presence of young pedestrians in the area. His investigation had revealed that the intersection lacked adequate signage and traffic control devices to ensure safe passage for children who walked to school along this route every day. The accident had been the result of systemic problems rather than individual negligence, requiring community-wide solutions rather than simple enforcement of traffic laws. The resolution had involved working with city traffic engineers to install new stop signs and crosswalk markings that provided better protection for pedestrians, along with educational programs that taught children about traffic safety and encouraged drivers to be more aware of pedestrian traffic in residential areas. The intersection now functioned safely, but Detective Harrison remembered it as an example of how individual incidents could reveal larger problems that required comprehensive solutions. The commercial district along Main Street contained several businesses that had been the subjects of investigations over the years, each case adding to Detective Harrison's understanding of how economic pressures and social relationships influenced crime patterns and community stability. Morrison's hardware store had been burglarized twice during the 1970s, incidents that had led to improved security measures and stronger connections between business owners and local law enforcement. The first burglary had occurred during a period when the store was struggling financially, creating vulnerabilities that had attracted the attention of people looking for easy targets for theft. The investigation had revealed that the burglars had inside knowledge about the store's security procedures and inventory, suggesting involvement by someone with legitimate access to the building. The case had been solved when Detective Harrison's patient investigation identified a former employee who had been providing information to accomplices about when the store would be unattended and what valuable merchandise would be available for theft. The resolution had involved not just criminal prosecution, but also improvements to hiring procedures and security protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The second burglary had been more random, committed by teenagers who had broken into the store looking for tools and equipment they could sell to support drug habits. This case had led to broader discussions about substance abuse prevention and treatment, resources that could address the underlying problems that motivated young people to commit crimes. Detective Harrison had worked with store management to develop relationships with social service agencies and educational programs that could provide alternatives for young people who might otherwise turn to criminal activity to meet their financial needs. The store had become a community resource that provided employment opportunities and mentorship for teenagers, while also maintaining the security measures necessary to prevent theft. The old movie theater on Main Street had been closed for several years now, but Detective Harrison remembered when it had been the center of investigations involving fights and disturbances that had occurred during weekend showings of popular films. The incidents had required careful analysis to understand how crowd dynamics and social tensions could create situations where minor disagreements escalated into violence. The theater management had worked with police to develop crowd control procedures and security measures that could prevent problems without creating an atmosphere of excessive surveillance or restriction. The solutions had included better lighting in the lobby and restroom areas, along with staff training that helped employees recognize and diffuse potential conflicts before they became serious disturbances. Detective Harrison had learned valuable lessons about crowd psychology and conflict prevention through his work at the theater, understanding how environmental factors and management practices could influence whether large gatherings remained peaceful or developed into situations requiring police intervention. These lessons had proven applicable to many other investigations involving public gatherings and community events. Walking through the residential area west of downtown, Detective Harrison passed houses that had been involved in various investigations over the years, each one adding to his comprehensive understanding of how crime and community interacted in complex ways that required careful attention to social context and individual circumstances. The house at 1247 Elm Street had been the site of a domestic violence investigation that had required multiple visits and extensive coordination with social service agencies to address the underlying problems that had created dangerous situations for family members. The case had demonstrated the importance of treating domestic violence as a community problem rather than simply a criminal matter, requiring resources and support that went beyond traditional law enforcement responses. Detective Harrison had worked with the family to develop safety plans and access to counseling services that could address the psychological and economic factors that had contributed to the violent behavior. The resolution had taken months to accomplish, involving court proceedings, social service interventions, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that protective measures remained effective. The case had been successful in ending the violence and preserving the family relationships that were worth saving, but it had required patience and creativity that went beyond traditional police procedures. Detective Harrison had documented this case as an example of how effective law enforcement often involved addressing root causes rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. The house at 892 Pine Street had been burglarized during a particularly active period when several residential break-ins had occurred within a few weeks, creating concerns about neighborhood safety and requiring a comprehensive investigation that looked at patterns and connections between different incidents. The investigation had revealed that the burglaries were being committed by a small group of individuals who were systematically targeting houses that appeared to be unoccupied during daytime hours. The case had been resolved through community cooperation and improved communication between neighbors who agreed to watch each other's properties during work hours and report suspicious activity to police. The resolution had also involved improved home security measures and changes in daily routines that made houses less attractive targets for burglars. Detective Harrison had learned about the importance of community participation in crime prevention through this case, understanding that effective security often depended more on social connections and mutual awareness than on technological solutions or increased police patrols. The neighborhood had become safer through improved relationships between residents, rather than simply through law enforcement efforts. As evening deepened and Detective Harrison completed his walk through the familiar neighborhoods, he reflected on how each location held multiple layers of history and meaning that were invisible to most observers but formed an essential part of his understanding of how the community functioned. Every street corner, every building, every small business contained memories of investigations that had taught him important lessons about human nature and social dynamics. The city had become an archive of experience for Detective Harrison, a living repository of cases that had shaped his approach to police work and his understanding of how law enforcement could contribute to community stability and safety. Each investigation had added to his knowledge about how crime emerged from specific social and economic conditions, and how effective responses required understanding these underlying factors rather than simply addressing immediate violations. The quiet streets held these memories peacefully, having absorbed the tensions and conflicts that had once demanded urgent attention and transformed them into the stable, safe environment that residents now took for granted. The houses glowed with warm light from windows where families gathered for evening meals and children completed homework assignments, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that reflected the successful resolution of problems that had once threatened community peace. Walking back toward the police station as his shift concluded, Detective Harrison understood that his years of service had contributed to this peaceful evening scene. But he also recognized that community safety was an ongoing collaboration that required the continued attention and participation of everyone who lived in these neighborhoods. The city's archive of memory would continue to grow with new cases and new challenges, but the foundation of trust and cooperation that had been built through decades of patient police work would provide the stability necessary for addressing whatever problems might arise in the future. In the gathering darkness, the city settled into its nightly rhythm of rest and reflection, holding within its familiar geography the accumulated wisdom of countless investigations and resolutions that had taught important lessons about how people could learn to live together safely and peacefully. The streets themselves had become repositories of experience that would guide future efforts to maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and community responsibility that made civilized life possible. Chief Archivist Eleanor Matthews moved through the deepest section of the records vault with the reverence that befitted someone who understood. She was walking among the completed stories of human conflict and resolution. This was where the oldest files came to rest, cases that had been investigated, resolved, and sealed according to the protocols that governed the permanent preservation of police records. Here, in climate-controlled silence, thousands of manila folders held there secrets with the patient dignity of experiences that had been transformed from urgent crises into historical documentation. The vault extended further underground than most people realized, carved into bedrock that provided natural protection for records that needed to be preserved for decades or even centuries. The air circulation systems hummed with barely audible efficiency, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity levels that would ensure these documents remained readable for future researchers who might need to understand how law enforcement had evolved and how communities had addressed the challenges of maintaining order and justice. Eleanor had spent the better part of her career in these archives, arriving 30 years earlier as a young clerk and gradually developing the expertise and institutional memory that made her the guardian of the department's vast collection of historical records. She understood the geography of these underground corridors better than anyone else, knowing where to find specific types of cases and how to navigate the complex filing systems that had evolved over the decades as different administrations had implemented their own approaches to record keeping. Section she was visiting today contained files from cases that had been closed for more than 25 years, investigations that had been completed and sealed according to legal requirements and departmental policies. These were the stories that had found their endings, conflicts that had been resolved through the patient application of investigative techniques and legal procedures that had restored order to situations where human behavior had temporarily disrupted community peace. She paused at a filing cabinet that contained cases from the 1960s, pulling open the heavy drawer to reveal rows of folders that had aged to a gentle cream color but remained in excellent condition due to the careful environmental controls that protected them from deterioration. Each folder represented hours of police work, from initial response through investigation, arrest, prosecution, and final resolution, creating comprehensive documentation of how the criminal justice system had addressed specific violations of law and community standards. The first file she examined contained the complete record of a burglary case that had been investigated by Detective Robert Chun in 1967, when a series of break-ins in the Riverside district had required months of patient detective work to solve. The file contained initial incident reports, witness statements, evidence inventories, and the detailed investigative notes that had eventually led to the identification and arrest of the perpetrator. Reading through Detective Chen's methodical documentation, Eleanor could trace the evolution of his understanding as the investigation progressed and new information emerged. The case had been solved through careful attention to patterns and the gradual accumulation of evidence rather than dramatic breakthroughs or sudden revelations. Detective Chun had interviewed dozens of residents, examined physical evidence from multiple crime scenes, and coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to develop the comprehensive understanding that had made arrests and convictions possible. The resolution of the burglary case had involved not just criminal prosecution, but also efforts to address the underlying economic and social problems that had motivated the criminal behavior. The perpetrator had been a young man struggling with unemployment and family responsibilities, leading Detective Chun to work with social service agencies to develop a comprehensive approach that included restitution to victims, job training programs, and ongoing supervision that would prevent future criminal activity. The file contained follow-up reports documenting the success of this comprehensive approach, showing how the young man had completed his restitution obligations, found stable employment, and maintained a law-abiding lifestyle for the remainder of the period covered by departmental records. Detective Chun had concluded his final report with observations about the importance of addressing root causes rather than simply punishing criminal behavior, insights that had influenced departmental policies for years to come. Eleanor carefully returned the burglary file to its proper position and pulled another folder, this one containing records from a missing person case that had required extensive coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. The case involved an elderly woman who had disappeared from her apartment, leading to a search that had ultimately located her in a distant city where she had gone to care for a sick relative without informing anyone of her plans. The investigation had demonstrated the importance of understanding social connections and family relationships when trying to locate missing persons, with Detective Williams conducting extensive interviews with neighbors, family members, and community organizations that had regular contact with the elderly woman. His patient approach had eventually identified the sick relative and led to successful contact with the missing person, who had been found safe but embarrassed about the concern her absence had caused. The case files from this era reflected a different approach to police work than what characterized modern law enforcement, with more time available for thorough investigation and greater emphasis on understanding the social context of criminal behavior. Eleanor had observed these changes during her career, noting how increasing caseloads and technological developments had altered the pace and methods of police work while the fundamental goals remained unchanged. Moving to another section of the vault, Eleanor examined files from the 1970s, a period when social changes throughout the country had created new challenges for local law enforcement and required adaptive approaches to situations that had no clear precedent in previous police experience. These files documented how officers had developed innovative solutions to problems that emerged from changing social attitudes and economic conditions. Particularly thick file contained records from a fraud investigation that had required nearly 2 years to complete, involving a complex scheme that had victimized dozens of elderly residents through fake investment opportunities and insurance scams. Detective Martinez had approached the case with the methodical patience that characterized the best police work from that era, gradually building the evidence necessary to understand how the fraud operated and to identify all the perpetrators involved. The investigation had required coordination with federal agencies and police departments in multiple states, as the fraud scheme had operated across jurisdictional boundaries and involved sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection. Detective Martinez had documented each phase of the PM investigation with careful attention to legal requirements and evidentiary standards that would be necessary for successful prosecution in federal court. The resolution of the fraud case had resulted in multiple arrests and convictions, along with recovery of funds that could be returned to victims who had lost their life savings to the elaborate deception. More importantly, the investigation had led to improved educational programs that helped elderly residents recognize and avoid similar scams, creating ongoing protection against future fraud attempts. Eleanor found deep satisfaction in maintaining these records, understanding that they represented more than just historical documentation but rather a repository of wisdom about human nature and social dynamics that remained relevant regardless of how much time had passed since the original investigations. Each case had taught important lessons about effective police work and community relationship building that continued to influence current practices. The vault also contained files from major cases that had attracted significant public attention during their investigation, incidents that had tested the department's capabilities and required extraordinary efforts to resolve successfully. These cases were preserved with special care, as they represented important moments in the department's history and provided examples of how law enforcement had evolved to meet complex challenges. One such file documented a kidnapping case from 1978 that had mobilized the entire department and required coordination with federal agencies, neighboring police departments, and community volunteers who had participated in the search for the missing child. The case had been resolved successfully with the safe recovery of the child and the arrest of the perpetrator, but it had also revealed important lessons about crisis management and community cooperation. The kidnapping investigation had demonstrated how effective law enforcement required public trust and participation, with community members providing crucial information and assistance that had made the successful resolution possible. The case files documented not just the investigative techniques that had been employed, but also the communication strategies that had maintained public confidence while protecting the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Eleanor moved slowly through the archives, checking the condition of files and ensuring that the preservation systems were functioning properly to protect these irreplaceable records. The climate control systems required constant monitoring to maintain the precise environmental conditions that would prevent deterioration while allowing continued access for researchers and legal professionals who might need to reference these historical cases. Each section of the vault was organized according to case type, date, and legal status, creating a comprehensive system that made specific files accessible while maintaining the security and integrity that was essential for official records. Eleanor had developed detailed catalogs and cross-reference systems that allowed researchers to locate relevant cases even when they had only partial information about specific investigations. The preservation work also involved periodic examination of individual files to identify any signs of deterioration that might require special conservation treatment. Most of the files remained in excellent condition due to the careful environmental controls, but some required additional protection or specialized storage techniques to ensure their long-term preservation. Eleanor paused at a section containing files from cases that had been particularly significant for their impact on departmental policies and procedures. Investigations that had revealed important insights about effective law enforcement and community relations. These cases had been designated for special preservation due to their educational value and their influence on the development of modern police practices. One file contained records from a community policing initiative that had been pioneered in the Riverside district during the early 1980s, when officers had experimented with new approaches to crime prevention and community engagement. The program had involved assigning officers to specific neighborhoods for extended periods, allowing them to develop detailed knowledge of local conditions and relationships that enhance their effectiveness in addressing both criminal activity and underlying social problems. The community policing experiment had been carefully documented and evaluated, with reports showing significant improvements in both crime statistics and community satisfaction with police services. The success of the program had led to its expansion throughout the city and had influenced similar initiatives in other law enforcement agencies across the region. Eleanor had been involved in preserving the documentation from this groundbreaking program, understanding that it represented an important evolution in police work that emphasized collaboration and prevention rather than simply response and enforcement. The files contain detailed reports about implementation challenges, community feedback, and long-term outcomes that continued to inform current community policing efforts. As the day progressed and Eleanor completed her preservation work in the vault, she reflected on the thousands of human stories that surrounded her in these carefully maintained files. Each case represented people who had faced difficult circumstances and found resolution through the patient application of legal processes and community support. The conflicts and crises that had once demanded urgent attention had been transformed into peaceful documentation that testified to the ongoing human effort to maintain order and justice. The sealed files represented closure and completion. Stories that had found their proper endings through the careful work of investigators, prosecutors, and community members who had participated in the complex processes that restored order when it had been temporarily disrupted. The resolution of each case had contributed to the gradual accumulation of wisdom and experience that made future police work more effective and community life more stable. Eleanor understood that her role as guardian of these archives was about more than simple record keeping. She was preserving the institutional memory that would guide future law enforcement efforts and community development initiatives. The lessons embedded in these files would continue to influence how people approach the challenges of living together, peacefully despite their differences and conflicts. As evening approached and the vault settled into its deepest quiet, Eleanor completed her daily preservation tasks and prepared to return to the upper levels of the building. The files would rest undisturbed through the night, holding their secrets with the patient dignity that characterized all properly archived historical records. They would be available when needed, but for now they could rest in the peaceful silence that came with completed stories and resolved conflicts. The climate control systems would continue their vigilant work through the night, maintaining the precise environmental conditions that would preserve these records for future generations who might need to understand how their community had addressed the challenges of maintaining order and justice. The vault would hold its treasures safely, ensuring that the wisdom accumulated through decades of police work would remain available for as long as it might be needed. In the deepest quiet of the underground archives, surrounded by thousands of cases that had found their proper endings, Eleanor felt the profound satisfaction that came from understanding that her work contributed to something larger than individual investigations or specific crimes. These files represented the ongoing human struggle to create communities where people could live together safely and peacefully, guided by laws and institutions that protected individual rights while maintaining collective security. The sealed files rested in their permanent silence, holding within their manila covers the accumulated wisdom of countless investigations and resolutions that had transformed conflicts into lessons, crises into understanding, and problems into solutions. They were the final repositories of stories that had been lived, investigated, and resolved, now preserved for the guidance of future generations who would face their own challenges in maintaining the delicate balance that made civilized community life possible. As the vault settled into the stillness of another night, the files seemed to whisper their quiet assurance that human conflicts could be resolved, that justice could be achieved, and that communities could learn from their experiences to create ever better approaches to the fundamental challenges of living together in peace and mutual respect. The archive held its secrets gently, offering them as gifts of wisdom to anyone who would take the time to listen to the lessons they contained. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun returned to the archives one final time before her retirement. Walking the familiar corridors that had become as much a part of her life as her own home during the 35 years she had served with the department, the basement stretched before her in its eternal twilight, row upon row of filing cabinets holding the accumulated wisdom of decades. Each case a small but significant piece in the vast puzzle of human nature and community life that had consumed her professional attention for more than 3 decades. The fluorescent lights hummed, their familiar song as she moved slowly between the filing cabinets, her hand trailing along the smooth metal surfaces that had remained unchanged while everything else in law enforcement had evolved around them. The reports in these cabinets told the story not just of individual crimes and investigations, but of how an entire community had grown and changed. Learning from its experiences and gradually developing better approaches to the eternal challenges of maintaining order and justice, she paused at the section containing her own earliest cases, files from when she had been a young patrol officer, eager to make her mark, but still learning the patience and wisdom that would characterize her most successful work. The handwriting on those early reports seemed to belong to a different person, someone who had not yet understood that effective police work was less about dramatic action than about careful attention to the complex web of relationships and circumstances that shaped human behavior. Her first major case had involved a series of burglaries in the university district, where someone had been breaking into apartments occupied by college students during evening hours when most residents were attending classes or social activities. The investigation had taught her important lessons about understanding the social context of criminal activity, recognizing that effective prevention required addressing the underlying conditions that made certain locations attractive targets, rather than simply increasing patrol presence or improving security measures. The burglary case had been solved through community engagement rather than traditional detective work, with Detective Chun organizing meetings between students, landlords, and long-term residents to discuss security concerns and develop cooperative approaches to crime prevention. The resolution had involved improved lighting, better communication between neighbors, and educational programs that helped students understand how their daily routines could be modified to reduce their vulnerability to theft. Moving to another section of the archives, Detective Chun examined files from cases that had marked important turning points in her understanding of police work and community relations. Each investigation had taught her something new about human nature, about the social conditions that contributed to criminal behavior, and about the creative approaches that were often necessary to address problems that could not be solved through simple application of legal sanctions. One particularly significant case had involved a domestic violence situation that had required months of patient work to resolve safely and effectively. The initial call had seemed straightforward, but Detective Chun's investigation had revealed a complex family situation involving economic stress, mental health issues, and generational patterns of violence that required comprehensive intervention rather than simple arrest and prosecution. The case had been resolved through coordination with social service agencies, mental health professionals, and community organizations that could provide ongoing support for all family members affected by the violence. Detective Chun had learned about the importance of treating domestic violence as a community problem rather than simply a criminal matter, understanding that effective solutions required resources and expertise that went beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. The archives also contained files from cases that had required her to work with other law enforcement agencies, investigations that had crossed jurisdictional boundaries and demanded new approaches to coordination and information sharing. These cases had taught her about the importance of professional relationships and mutual respect between agencies that shared common goals, but operated under different policies and procedures. One multi-jurisdictional investigation had involved a fraud scheme that had victimized elderly residents throughout the region, requiring Detective Chun to coordinate with police departments, federal agencies, and regulatory organizations to develop a comprehensive understanding of how the scheme operated and to identify all the perpetrators involved. The case had taken nearly 2 years to resolve completely, but it had resulted in multiple arrests and convictions, while also leading to improved educational programs that helped elderly residents protect themselves from similar scams. Detective Chun reflected on how the nature of police work had changed during her career, with technological developments creating new types of crimes while also providing new tools for investigation and prevention. The basic human elements remained unchanged, but the methods and resources available to law enforcement had evolved dramatically during the decades she had spent in these archives. The introduction of computer databases had revolutionized record-keeping and information sharing, allowing investigators to identify patterns and connections that would have been nearly impossible to discover using manual filing systems. Detective Chun had been part of the transition from paper-based records to digital systems, understanding both the advantages and limitations of each approach to documentation and case management. Despite these technological changes, Detective Chun had learned that the most important aspects of police work remained fundamentally human: the ability to listen carefully to people who were experiencing crisis, the patience to conduct thorough investigations even when immediate solutions were not apparent, and the wisdom to understand that effective law enforcement required addressing underlying social problems rather than simply responding to their symptoms. Walking through the archives, Detective Chun could trace the evolution of her own understanding and the gradual development of expertise that had made her final years of service more effective than her earliest efforts. Each case had contributed to a growing understanding of how communities functioned and how law enforcement could contribute to social stability while respecting individual rights and dignity. The files surrounding her represented more than just criminal investigations. They were a comprehensive record of how one community had struggled with the eternal challenges of maintaining order and justice while adapting to changing social conditions and evolving understanding of effective law enforcement practices. The accumulated wisdom in these archives would continue to guide future officers and community leaders long after Detective Chun's retirement. She paused at a section containing files from community policing, initiatives that had been implemented during the middle years of her career, experiments in proactive engagement that had transformed the department's relationship with the neighborhoods it served. These programs had demonstrated that effective crime prevention often required police officers to become integral parts of the communities they served rather than outside authorities who intervened only when problems had already escalated to crisis levels. The community policing files documented both successes and failures, providing honest assessments of approaches that had worked well and others that had required modification or abandonment. Detective Chun had been involved in several of these initiatives, learning valuable lessons about the importance of cultural sensitivity, community input, and long-term commitment to relationship building that could not be achieved through short-term programs or superficial engagement efforts. One particularly successful community policing program had involved assigning officers to work closely with local schools, not just to respond to disciplinary problems, but to contribute to educational programs that helped young people understand their rights and responsibilities as community members. The program had resulted in improved relationships between police and youth while also providing early intervention for young people who were at risk of involvement in criminal activity. As evening approached and Detective Chun prepared to conclude her final visit to the archives, she reflected on the thousands of human stories that surrounded her in these carefully maintained files. Each case represented people who had faced difficult circumstances and found resolution through the patient application of legal processes and community support. Conflicts that had been transformed from urgent crises into historical documentation that would guide future efforts to maintain order and justice. The archives would continue to grow with new cases and new challenges, but the foundation of experience and wisdom that had been accumulated through decades of careful police work would provide stability and guidance for future officers who would face their own versions of the eternal human problems that required law enforcement intervention. The files held their secrets with quiet dignity, offering their lessons to anyone who would take the time to understand the complex realities of community life and human nature. Detective Chun understood that her retirement marked not an ending but a transition, as the wisdom she had gained through years of patient investigation and community engagement would continue to influence the department's approach to law enforcement through the officers she had trained and the policies she had helped develop. Her contributions had become part of the institutional memory that would guide future efforts to maintain the delicate balance between individual freedom and community security. Walking slowly toward the elevator that would carry her back to the upper floors of the building, Detective Chen felt deep satisfaction in understanding that her career had contributed to something larger than individual cases or specific investigations. She had been part of the ongoing human effort to create communities where people could live together safely and peacefully, guided by laws and institutions that protected individual rights while maintaining collective security. The archives would preserve the record of this work, holding within their climate-controlled silence the accumulated wisdom of countless investigations and resolutions that had taught important lessons about human nature and social dynamics. Future officers would consult these files when facing similar challenges, building on the foundation of experience that previous generations had created through their patient attention to the complex realities of law enforcement and community relations. As the elevator carried her upward toward the main floor of the building, Detective Chun carried with her the knowledge that the work would continue, that new officers would bring fresh perspectives and innovative approaches to the eternal challenges of maintaining order and justice. The archives would be there to guide them, offering the wisdom of experience while remaining open to new understanding and evolving practices that would make future law enforcement more effective and more responsive to community needs. The station above remained active with the ongoing business of police work, officers responding to calls and conducting investigations that would eventually join the vast collection of cases that filled the basement archives. The cycle would continue, with each new investigation adding to the accumulated understanding of how communities functioned and how law enforcement could contribute to social stability and individual security. In the gentle light of evening, the station settled into its familiar rhythm of night shift operations, ready to respond to whatever challenges the darkness might bring while drawing on the accumulated wisdom of decades of experience preserved in the files below. The stories would continue to be written, one case at a time, adding to the vast archive of human experience that testified to the ongoing effort to create communities where justice and peace could flourish together. The night stretched ahead with its quiet promise of rest and reflection, holding within its darkness the potential for new stories that would someday join the peaceful silence of the archives below. In the space between ending and beginning, the station breathed with the rhythm of stories yet to be written, ready to face whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring with the patient wisdom that had been accumulated through decades of careful attention to the complex realities of human nature and community life. Asterisk. Training Sergeant Michael Rodriguez walked the empty hallways of the police academy as the first hints of dawn began to filter through the tall windows that lined the main corridor. The building held a different kind of silence than the archives or the active station, a quieter expectancy that came from being a place where knowledge was passed from one generation to the next, where the accumulated wisdom of decades of police work was carefully transmitted to young officers who would soon carry forward the traditions and responsibilities of law enforcement. Academy had been designed with careful attention to creating an environment that would inspire respect for the profession while providing practical training in the skills and knowledge that effective police work required. The classrooms were spacious and well lit, equipped with modern technology, but arranged to encourage discussion and interactive learning rather than passive absorption of information. The training facilities included everything, from driving courses to mock crime scenes where recruits could practice the careful documentation and analysis that would become essential parts of their daily work. Sergeant Rodriguez had been teaching at the academy for 8 years, arriving each morning before the recruits to prepare lessons that would help them understand not just the technical aspects of police procedures, but the deeper principles of community service and professional responsibility that distinguished effective law enforcement from simple rule enforcement. His classroom overlooked the courtyard where recruits gathered between sessions, their conversations mixing the nervous energy of people learning new skills with the gradual confidence that came from understanding their growing competence. The curriculum that Sergeant Rodriguez taught had evolved considerably during his tenure at the academy, incorporating lessons learned from decades of police experience while adapting to changing social conditions and community expectations. The courses now included extensive training in conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and communication skills that helped officers understand their role as community problem solvers rather than simply law enforcers. One of his favorite classes focused on case studies drawn from the department's historical files, using real investigations to illustrate how patient, methodical police work could address complex human problems while building trust and cooperation within the communities that officers served. These case studies included examples of successful community policing, innovative approaches to crime prevention, and investigations that had revealed important insights about human nature and social dynamics. The recruits always responded well to these historical cases, understanding that they were learning from the actual experiences of officers who had faced similar challenges and developed effective solutions through careful thought and persistent effort. The cases provided concrete examples of how abstract principles could be applied to real situations, helping new officers understand the practical application of concepts like constitutional rights, due process, and community engagement. Sergeant Rodriguez unlocked his classroom and began arranging materials for the day's lessons, which would focus on domestic violence investigations and the complex skills required to address family conflicts that often involved multiple generations, economic pressures, and emotional dynamics that could not be resolved through simple legal interventions. The lesson plan included role-playing exercises, where recruits would practice the patience and sensitivity required to help families address underlying problems while ensuring immediate safety for all involved. Parties. The domestic violence curriculum had been developed through collaboration with social workers, psychologists, and community advocates who understood that effective police response required knowledge that went beyond traditional law enforcement training. The academy had brought in guest speakers who could share their expertise about family dynamics, trauma psychology, and the community, resources that could provide ongoing support for families affected by violence. Sergeant Rodriguez had learned that teaching about domestic violence required helping recruits understand their own emotional responses to family conflict while maintaining the professional objectivity necessary for effective intervention. Many young officers came to police work with strong feelings about family relationships and personal responsibility. But effective domestic violence response required the ability to work with people whose experiences and choices might challenge the officer's personal values and assumptions. The academy training emphasized that domestic violence cases often required multiple visits and ongoing engagement rather than single incident responses, helping recruits understand that successful resolution might take months or even years of patient work with families who were struggling to break cycles of violence that often persisted across generations. The training included practical exercises in safety planning, resource referral, and follow-up procedures that could help families access the support they needed to address underlying problems. As the morning progressed, and the academy building began to fill with the sounds of arriving staff and early recruits, Sergeant Rodriguez reviewed lesson plans for his afternoon class on fraud investigations. This course had become increasingly important as economic crimes grew more sophisticated and began to target vulnerable populations through increasingly complex schemes that required careful investigation and comprehensive community education efforts. Asterisk. The fraud curriculum included training in financial analysis, interview techniques, and coordination with regulatory agencies that had specialized expertise in different types of economic crimes. Recruits learned about the particular vulnerabilities that made elderly residents attractive targets for fraud, along with the communication skills necessary to work with victims who might be embarrassed about being deceived or reluctant to cooperate with investigations that required them to acknowledge their mistakes. Sergeant Rodriguez had developed partnerships with local banks, social service agencies, and consumer protection organizations that provided guest lecturers and practical training opportunities for recruits who needed to understand how financial institutions operated and what resources were available for victims of economic crimes. These partnerships had also created ongoing relationships that would benefit the recruits throughout their careers as they worked on cases that required specialized knowledge and community cooperation. The fraud training also emphasized prevention and education, helping recruits understand their role in community outreach efforts that could help residents recognize and avoid scams before they became victims. This proactive approach required officers to develop presentation skills and educational materials that could be used with senior citizen groups, community organizations, and other venues where people gathered to learn about topics that affected their safety and security. The Academy's physical training facilities reflected the same attention to practical application that characterized the academic curriculum, with courses that prepared recruits for the physical demands of police work while emphasizing safety procedures and stress management techniques that would help them maintain their health and effectiveness throughout long careers. The training recognized that police work required both physical and emotional resilience, with programs that addressed attrition, exercise, and stress reduction alongside tactical skills and equipment familiarity. Asterisk. Sergeant Rodriguez often observed the physical training sessions, noting how recruits gradually developed confidence in their abilities while learning to work as teams rather than individuals. The physical challenges were designed to build trust and cooperation between recruits who would need to rely on each other during their careers, creating bonds of mutual support that would enhance both their safety and their effectiveness as community police officers. The Academy also included extensive training in report writing and documentation, skills that many recruits initially underestimated, but which formed the foundation for all successful police work. Sergeant Rodriguez taught courses that emphasized the importance of precise language, comprehensive observation, and careful attention to detail that would make police reports useful for prosecutors, defense attorneys, and other professionals who needed to understand exactly what had occurred during criminal incidents. The report writing curriculum used examples from actual cases to illustrate how thorough documentation could make the difference between successful prosecution and dismissed charges, helping recruits understand that their written reports were often more important than their testimony in determining how cases were resolved. The training included exercises in describing complex situations clearly and accurately, while maintaining the objective tone that was essential for professional police documentation. Recruits learned about the legal requirements for different types of reports, the evidentiary standards that governed criminal prosecution, and the importance of preserving the chain of custody for physical evidence. that might be needed months or years after its initial collection. They practice documenting crime scenes, conducting interviews, and preparing comprehensive reports that would withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and appellate courts. As afternoon approached and Sergeant Rodriguez prepared for his fraud investigation class, he reflected on how much satisfaction he derived from watching recruits develop from nervous beginners into confident professionals who understood their responsibilities to the communities they would serve. The transformation usually took several months, as academic learning was gradually supplemented by practical exercises and field training that helped recruits apply their knowledge to real situations. The Academy's field training program paired recruits with experienced officers who could provide mentorship and guidance during the crucial transition from classroom learning to active police work. These partnerships were carefully arranged to ensure that recruits worked with officers who exemplified the professional standards and community engagement, principles that the Academy sought to instill in all graduates. Field training supervisors were selected based on their demonstrated commitment to community policing principles, their patience in working with new officers, and their ability to model the problem-solving approaches that distinguished effective police work from simple rule enforcement. The supervisors received special training in educational techniques and performance evaluation that helped them provide constructive feedback and support for recruits who were still developing their professional skills. Sergeant Rodriguez maintained contact with many Academy graduates throughout their careers, providing ongoing consultation and support as they encountered new challenges and continued to develop their expertise. These relationships created networks of professional support that enhanced the effectiveness of individual officers while strengthening the department's overall commitment to community service and continuous improvement. The Academy building itself had been designed to reinforce the values and principles that the curriculum sought to instill, with architectural features that emphasized openness, accessibility, and respect for both the law enforcement profession and the communities that police officers served. The main entrance featured displays that honored fallen officers, while also celebrating successful community partnerships and innovative approaches to crime prevention and problem solving. The library and resource center contained extensive collections of legal materials, case studies, and professional development resources that would be available to graduates throughout their careers. The Academy encouraged lifelong learning and professional development, understanding that effective police work required ongoing education and adaptation to changing social conditions and legal requirements. As evening approached and the Academy building settled into its quieter rhythm, Sergeant Rodriguez completed his preparation for the following day's classes and reflected on the important role that training played in maintaining the quality and integrity of law enforcement services. Each group of recruits represented the future of policing, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of previous generations while bringing fresh perspectives and energy to the eternal challenges of maintaining order and justice. The Academy stood as a bridge between past and future, preserving the lessons learned through decades of police experience, while preparing new officers to address challenges that might require innovative approaches and creative problem-solving. In the peaceful quiet of evening, the building held within its walls the promise of continued progress toward more effective and more responsive law enforcement that would serve community needs, while respecting individual rights and dignity. The night settled gently over the Academy grounds, holding within its silence the dreams and aspirations of recruits who were learning to transform their desire to serve into the skills and knowledge that would make their service effective and meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new lessons and new challenges, but the foundation of wisdom and principle would remain constant, guiding new officers toward the patient, thoughtful approach to police work that had proven most effective in building trust and maintaining peace within diverse communities.